So welcome, Carlos.
Thank you.
Yep.
As I mentioned to Pete, I was trying to get a hold of, one of the emails I sent out didn't work. Finally, Pete responded. So I can't tell who's who at the moment. I'll get to know you guys eventually.
Sure.
But just a brief introduction. I don't want to take up too much of your time, but I realize that you people are probably curious as to who's this new guy. I'm an engineer by trade and education, and but I do see the light, the Plato's cave. So I went out and I noticed that there was other things out there. And as a consequence, I'm interested in this sort of exchange, the opportunity of which I don't have very much. So in this initial one, I probably will just listen.
Yeah, no problem. Always welcome. And a lot of us here are engineers of one kind or another. I mean, I work in software. I think Craig is a retired physicist, the right way of putting it. Pete works in software. Joe is a retired economist. So we're not all philosophy professors here.
That is less intimidating then.
And Jim, who's just, you see a musical note there, that's because he's a recording studio engineer, so sound engineer.
Okay.
So welcome. I think we had like a dozen people signed up. There's always some late trickles in, et cetera. We're only 2 minutes in, but we could do our usual round. Usual round of question I have for everybody is very simple. Did you manage to do the reading? Have you ever read any of this stuff before? If you read it a long time ago, how long ago? And then we then generally do first reactions to it around the table from each person. And then I'll lay out some of the things that we want to do together and try to go through the sections of the text with a little bit more explication, and then give you guys a chance to ask all your any of your questions, either about a specific passage in the text or anything in the explanation so far, conversation so far, et cetera. And then usually a brief overview of what we're going to do next time. This time I'm going to front load one thing though, which is about, for next time we are doing part 4, which is the being of the cupola, sort of logic and truth kind of chapter. And I talked about doing the part 2 as a single session. After reviewing it, I realized we have to split that into 2. We have to spend 2 sessions on the part 2. That split is going to be just section 19, which is on time and temporality, basically pages 227 to 274, and then we'll do the balance of the book, that is sections 20 to 22. As a final session. That breaks it into 2 things about 50 pages each. It would be way too big if we tried to do the whole thing in one go. So next time is just going to be chapter 4, part 1. The time after that is just going to be section 19, the first section of part 2. And then we'll have a final session on the balance of part 2. Anyway, I just wanted to lay that out there because it's a slight difference from what we talked about before. Welcome. Is that Nick coming in? Welcome, Nick.
Hi.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, so we're just getting into the did you manage to do the reading kind of stuff. By the way, we get to Pete. I know he may mention he put up something that was a sort of kind of fun textual analysis thing of the of the chapter, our reading. On the site below the meetup, if you want to check it out. It takes you to an external link where you can see some things like word frequency and word clouds of which terms occur, and you can look at like line graphs of which is the most common word in each part of the text as you go through it, and so forth. Anyway, so we want to start with did you do the reading, Pete?
So yeah, I got through it Tuesday. Quite pleased. Reached the end, and I've dipped back into it a few times in the last couple days, and I hadn't really read this Kant part of Heidegger's destructuring since the 90s, I think. So I was not familiar with it. So it was like new again.
So that's a related question. So had you read any of the Kant he's talking about here, either Grounding the Metaphysics of Morals or Critique of Pure Reason?
No, I've never read Kant directly, only secondary sources.
Yeah, okay. Challenging in his own right. Metaphysics of Morals is sort of the much more accessible, and it's like the commonly assigned thing, and that sort of covers his moral personality section here. But the harder stuff, which is the basis for all that, is the Critique of Pure Reason stuff. The particular section that he's talking about is off in the section on the parallelisms of pure reason. It's off in the, I don't know, you're 400 pages in, right? So he's have a bunch of things which can be based upon deductions of what he thinks he's already proven or shown by then. But one of the nice things about the critique is it's so well organized. You can easily find the section you're looking for. It is a extremely outlined work, and if you just look for the sections in the transcendental dialectic that are called the parallelisms of pure reason, you can definitely find the section that Kant is focused on for all the sections about the problems of trying to ascribe anything to the transcendental person. But anyway, we'll get to all that when we get to it. I just wanted to mention there that mostly we just asked if people did the assigned reading, but here, because he's also talking about somebody else, it's helpful for me in terms of knowing what to go over if I know people's level of familiarity with Kant, the thinker he's talking about here. Okay. Sometimes we do introduction stuff, but I think we keep that low just for those who don't know. Pete is very knowledgeable on Heidegger. He's been studying for a long time. Want to get to Carlos next. Just very quick question. Did you manage to do the reading? Have you read any of Heidegger before? Have you read any of the Kant stuff he's talking about before?
Secondary sources, not the particular reading that you are focusing on today. I became aware of it with the announcement for the meeting. I didn't have enough time. Amazon is not going to deliver it to me in time for me to read it.
Gotcha.
But it's in order, so I should be able to have some reading. I have read secondary stuff on Heidegger by Thomas Sheehan. He wrote, Making Sense of Heidegger, Paradigm Shift. I've been reading that for 2 years. So terminology is a little bit better now than it used to be at the beginning.
And what about familiarity with Kant?
I have Critique of Pure Reason, and it's like chewing on bricks. But I've had it for years. I cannot claim familiarity. I've read secondary sources again, but I am by virtue of the references of Heidegger and other philosophers have made to him, I've become somewhat familiar and underlined somewhat.
Understood. It's very useful to know the level of familiarity, so it helps me know how much detail to get into there. But thanks. Joe.
Well, okay. I finished the reading this morning, as is my usual wont. I read I think the last 8 pages this morning. And to say that I read them this morning, the last 3 pages I think I read 5 times, and the last 5 pages I think I read 4 times. Because it starts getting really sort of sorting things out. These modes of existence, and what this being in the world without the hyphens is. It's just great stuff. I have never read the Kant. Although I know I've seen Kant referred to innumerable times in things I've read over the decades, because obviously he's some kind of cornerstone of almost all of things that seem to be relevant in later things, in later writers, whatever. I was aware that there were other preliminaries. I knew that I'd heard of Leibniz and I'd heard of Descartes, but I knew very, very little about them. And then, of course, our earlier discussions introduced Suarez and brought it all to light better. I'm very much a neophyte, but I find this being issue, this topic that Heidegger is focusing on, to be really, really fascinating. In the earlier part of the month, when I was reading the earlier parts of the chapter, I found that I could get absorbed and go for like 7 or 8 pages in one sitting before even thinking about refilling my glass of Coca-Cola. It was just totally focused material, and I found it attractive, very much so. But I really did find the last several parts of this chapter to be
Challenging.
Yeah, it's almost like
he's definitely speaking in his own terms at that point. So it's less familiar than when he's trying to explicate Kant, when he's just laying out his own take on things. So he's using his own language, so to speak.
Yeah, and I want you to clarify later on his continually flipping back and forth, talking about the older version of ontology and the improvements he's made, and that sort of stuff. That's not clear.
Sure. All right, Craig. Reading familiarity for now.
As usual, not that much familiarity. We got introduced to both of them when I took my philosophy courses, but I realized that's been now almost 50 years. So not that much gain on it. I did get through the reading. The first 40 pages of dealing with Kant and all that kind of stuff was just a slog. I mean, it was tough going. It was hard to get through. Then once he got into talking about his own stuff, it opened up, and I just really enjoyed the last 20 pages. So I thought the last 20 pages were good. They brought up a lot of questions that I'm ready to ask when we get to those last 20 pages. But I thoroughly enjoyed doing just the straight Heidegger presenting his stuff without trying to trash Kant. So.
Yeah, so it is worth tracking through the chapter, the places where he's kind of agreeing with Kant or praising Kant, and the places where he is, as you put it, trashing him. But there's certainly some of that. So Nick, this is just you're next, and I'm just asking, did you manage to do the reading? Did you have familiarity with any of this stuff before, either this bits of Heidegger or any of the Kant stuff he's talking about?
Yeah, so I read the thing yesterday because I noticed that the meeting was going to be today, so I was glad I was able to go through it. So I read through 50 pages of it yesterday, so rather quickly. So I think I picked up a lot, but I missed a lot, I'm sure, and I don't remember a lot as well. As far as background, I have read the critiques, the 3 critiques once, and again I picked up the main stuff. I don't remember all of it, but I need would have been nice to be able to read. I need to read Kant again, to be able to really absorb it. Same thing with this. I need to read this one again. But the interesting thing about this is because I have read B and T almost finished, but not quite. I think I have 50 pages left to read. So it's so much. This is so much easier to read than Being in Time, and he explains himself so much better here, and I can see that when he wants to, he can write in a way that's very understandable. So yes.
Yeah, I mean, certainly when he's being expository about someone else's thought, he can be usefully clear, etc. Some people have the experience reading Being in Time that it's quite difficult because it's so different from the way they thought about things before. The other side of it is, if you just want to understand his own views on things as opposed to trying to keep track of this multi-level conversation of what he's saying, was going on in history that Kant was reacting to, and Kant's actual reaction to it, and then his reaction to that reaction to, that sort of multi-voice level of this history expository stuff. Some people find that actually harder and more complicated to track than just any positive sets of statements of what the guy thinks himself. But different approaches there. The expository stuff can be easier for people who've got a lot of familiarity with the people he's talking about and are more familiar with his other philosophies and just need to understand his by contrast. But if you don't have that basis, it can make it more challenging rather than less. But fine comments. Okay, Douglas, welcome. And just letting you know, what we usually do here is we're going around and asking people, did they manage to do the reading? Were they familiar with any of this material from before, the Heidegger or or the Kant. We'll get to first.
Well, I
reactions after
should.
that.
I should know it. I'm a doctor of philosophy, okay, taught in a university, so I should definitely know a little bit about Kant and Heidegger, okay, and the whole thing is both. A lot of it doesn't make sense to a lot of my students until they understand that they're two philosophers trying to put each other in a different thing. Kant said, "I think, therefore I am." And Heidegger is actually going against the grain.
I think that was Descartes, but Kant might have agreed with it though. Fair enough. So were you able to do the reading of the chapter for this call?
I didn't get to it this time. I remember it from, I'm retired now, retired college professor, but I did have it, I did teach Heidegger and I taught Kant.
Gotcha. Okay. So useful. Jim?
Hello. Yes, I read it.
Sounding a little weird there, Jim.
I had a tough time reading.
You need to bring it down. You're way high pitched.
The volume is okay.
You sound a little bit like Donald Duck or something.
Yes.
Yeah, I would say tone down on the helium or something.
I was gonna say helium might be the way to get into this stuff. I don't know.
You mean, hold on 1 second. I don't know why it's
Sorry, you have to exercise some sound engineering skills, and we'll come back to you. Jeff?
Yeah, I gave it a. By the way, last week I somehow had it in my calendar as an hour later, which is why I missed so much of it, and I was exhausted anyway. So at this time I gave it a real try, but I only made it through 13. I underlined things like crazy, but then I realized I'm underlining things that made sense to me already. I mean, there wasn't any new content. It was just like something I could grab onto to not just like have words flowing past my head, which is, I think, is the way most people read most things anyway. So
you were underlining it because it was something you understood.
Yeah, like, oh, there's something, I got that, but it already did. So I can't say I really learned anything from it. It seems like a lot of times it's just verbiage, really. I don't know. So I know Craig was, said he liked the last 20 pages, but I didn't even get close to that because I think I got about 40 pages left.
Got it. So you got through the part where it's talking about the Kantian three persons, but that's about it. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Jim, do you want to try one more time, or are you still working on it? You're still working on it. Okay, Dan, why don't we're just asking people if they managed to do the reading, if they had any familiarity with this Heidegger from before or with the Kant he's talking about.
Yeah, hi. I read this book a few months ago, and I read several other Heidegger's book, and I'm also familiar with Kant. I read his critiques at some point.
Great. So do you know how recently for either this Heidegger or the Kant?
Sorry? What?
How recently did you do the reading for this time, or just had read it before 6 months ago, or
I think it was like about 8 months ago I read this book. Like, for example, I finished a few days ago the one on Plato, the essence of true and Daum. I'm going through ponderings. And
I understand.
Kant, I think it's about a year ago I read his critiques.
Okay,
I reread
gotcha.
them actually. Yeah.
Gotcha. The reason I'm asking is that sometimes we're focused on a particular text. If you're reading some other things by the same author now, right? It's very easy for those ideas to crowd in, and that can be useful for perspective, but can also be distracting for other people who don't know the things you're talking about, right? So it's just one of the reasons we try to read things together is so we can focus our attention just on one piece of the animal at a time. But just something to keep in mind. But it's fine. I know you've been devouring tons of it, so you've got to drink at your own pace, so to speak.
I will keep that in mind, and I'll stay with the text.
Yeah, great. Okay, Jim, have you fixed your audio? You're on mute right now.
Muted?
Now you're high pitched.
I don't know why it's doing that. but I don't want you guys to have to hear.
Can't hear you. It's just high pitched squeaky.
Huh, that's weird.
Oh, that's weird. I think you
Try,
said.
try logging out and coming back in because it's like it's.
Good idea.
Good
Sorry.
idea. Okay.
I want to learn how to do that.
Well, it's impressive. Okay. We have to decide if we want to try to do first reactions. I might poll people on it because we've got like 10 people here and it could take a while to do. But I still think it might be useful to have first reactions and maybe a special focus on questions, areas that you want to focus on. And if you either didn't do the reading, you can skip over it, or if you only got a certain ways, there's only a particular question you have, you can keep it short. But let's do a round of that for just very first impressions. We got a little bit of that from I found this part more comprehensible than that part, but general first impressions and specific areas you'd like to make sure that we talk about. Joe, you want to go first?
Have to find the unmute button. Yeah, I'm particularly interested in like some of the material that came up in the last, I don't know, 2 sections of the current chapter.
Yes, all the being in the world stuff, basically.
Yeah, because it seems that since existence, the mode of being of Dasein has now been sort of enlarged, or something's been added, and that's now the existence of this in the world thing. And I think that another way of tossing noun substance substitutes at it would be to say, okay, well, that's what colloquially we call reality. The fact that we exist, we design exist with this other stuff that exists at our same level of existence. It's not extant. And then he makes the interesting distinction between extant things that are intra-world. Did I get that correct?
Yeah, intra-worldly, yes.
Intra-worldly. Okay, and so I've been always trying to, in my own mind, trying to visualize it. I've got this sort of background incoherent belief in a quantum reality or something that exists. Okay, so the word exists, capital E or something, so it gets dropped on top of it. And then from that, in all kinds of interesting ways, most of which I don't understand, things that are being formulated from it. For example, sitting there looking at a chair, and he does bring up the chair case as a later discussion. So I'm looking at a chair. What am I actually seeing? Well, I suppose my first expectation is I'm also seeing the quantum worlds that form it, but they're too small for me to see. So, and they hang together in ways that follow the strong and weak nuclear force and stuff like that, which are something that puzzle me anyway, as where they come from. But the chair as such, contrasted with all the materials that are in it, is a chair because humans use it for sitting down. And that's where the intentionality and the focus on something for,
yeah,
so forth, makes perfect sense.
The equipmental context, as he puts it, yes.
Exactly. But this gives me a very nice sort of hierarchy of visualization of everything that I've always sort of just tossed around and said, oh, well, reality is there. That's what reality is. It's not imaginary, But you see what I'm fishing for here. How do these words hang together? And what's the real easiest way to interpret them in the Heideggerian way?
Sure. So let's start with just the basic outline of the chapter. And we got to this chapter from the previous one because the claim was that the notion of essence and existence that we saw in the medievals didn't seem to be sufficient for the kind of being that we are, or for consciousness, or for mind, or something like that. And that's what led us into the thesis of modern ontology as a topic, right? But the core idea at the start of the chapter is that modern ontology is focused on this subjective pole of things, so to speak, and the distinction between the extended things and the thinking things, right? So what it means for something to be a thinking thing, what consciousness is, what Dasein or being in the world or existence are, right? Those are different ways of getting at the same subject matter, which is the distinguishing something like the thought, mind, consciousness, something like that, whole of things from the extent, nature, intraworldly, extended things. I don't know if side of things is the right way of putting it, but a division of beings into those which are mind-like and those which are material-like or extended, right? And that's what you see at the origin of modern philosophy and people like Descartes, is this fundamental distinction between the consciousness which he thinks that he knows with greater certainty than he knows the external world, versus the external world which he understands with different categories and uses to understand consciousness, something like that. So that's the fundamental theme of the whole chapter. And he's going to start off with just that theme, and then Kant's take on what the consciousness side of that distinction is, or what this res cogitans is. How do you understand a res cogitans, a thinking thing, right? How do we understand that as Kant understands it? And then he's going to have his own criticisms of whether or not he thinks that Kantian explication of the thing that thinks is adequate or not, right? Of what seems to be correct about it, but also what seems to be incorrect or missing about it. And that's going to lead him to his own formulation of that distinction. And what you're talking about there about being in the world versus intraworldly being is something like Heidegger's own version of that distinction. The intraworldly beings are kind of corresponding to the extended things, the res extensia, right? And the things which exist, the things which have the manner of being of Dasein, which has the manner of being in the world, right, are like the res cogitans, are like the now it's not exactly lined up, but that's the distinction he's going to use to replace the modern ontology distinction of res extensa versus res cogitans. He's going to replace that with intraworldly on the one hand and existent on the other. But realize that last is his own language for it, right? That's his own interpretation for it, which he's going to argue / maintain, try to prove is more adequate to the facts of the case, to the phenomena, to the evidence than what came before, right? All of this is part of his, trying to learn from the tradition, but also from its problems, see where it left things unsolved and try to get farther on solving them, right? So that's the basic structure of the chapter. It's trying to investigate the notion of res cogitans, of the thing that thinks. Okay, so that's just reactions to your first focus there. Jim, you want to try again?
How's this?
Oh my gosh, you're so much better.
Not
Okay.
a munchkin anymore.
So we're going to come back to you for the question of, did you manage to do the reading and level of familiarity with before, and what about having read any of the Kant that he's talking about?
I read it. I did read it. I'm pretty familiar with Heidegger now, I think. You would know better than me. I think it's safe to say I'm pretty familiar with Heidegger now. I swear to God, I've read Critique of Pure Reason back when I was a teenager. Just like I remember Leibniz, I remember monads. That's about the extent of my remembering. And then, but I've read I've gotten a lot of Kant via Heidegger and other, like, this history of philosophy stuff. But I'm not really familiar with all of his works. But I vaguely remember Critique of Pure Reason. So it was, in fact, one of the things I was worried about was like, oh, now I'm going to go back and read it, and I'm going to be interpreting it through the lens of Heidegger, because I've just had my mind saturated with his views of what it all means, but that's okay.
So
yes.
First reactions to the chapter, since we're compressing both of your answers into one.
I thoroughly enjoyed it. I really did. But I have some nagging questions that in the beginning, what he is defining, the bifurcation of the corporeal realm, with the physical world, which is how you would look at what Descartes did. And I get all that, but it's like there's a couple of little things he said that make me wonder if he has the right to do what he did, if he's still going to use Descartes', like you said, he sort of redid it his way, but I don't agree with Descartes doing the whole thing in the first place. But there's certain terms I'd want to define, I'd want to have defined for me by you to make sure I got some of this understood it right, because I was sticking in my mind the whole time.
Sure.
What is perception? What is visual perception? That's a big deal. You can't just gloss over that term like, oh yeah, we all agree with what it is, because we don't.
Right.
That's where I got stuck.
And to be clear, I mean, Heidegger has a sort of grounding in a particular take on those sorts of questions, which is not primarily coming from Kant, although he's, you know, surrounded by neo-Kantians in his time and place and understands their views of things, but instead coming from Husserl and Husserl's phenomenological understanding of things like perception. Later, if you find people like Merleau-Ponty, you know, writing whole books on just the phenomenology of perception, but the version that is sort of background to Heidegger's take on it would be the stuff you find in Husserl. But that's only background to it, because he does not simply agree with Husserl. There's parts of even this chapter that are critical of Husserl or trying to go beyond him. Husserl himself has a definite debt to Descartes, even more so than to Kant. He jumps back over Kant to Descartes places. If you're interested, this is a useful book on that connection, Cartesian Meditations by Husserl. But Heidegger is not dependent upon the idea that Descartes had the right starting point, right? But he does think that that Kant gives a sort of more rigorous conceptual explication or explanation of where Descartes was starting from, that Heidegger thinks is basically faithful to what Descartes was trying to say. And this is specifically about what the res cogitans structure is supposed to be. The quick and dirty version of that is, in Kant this is, a res cogitan is something whose determinations are thoughts. That's the formula for it. So thoughts are things that it has that are its determinations, and its determinations are something like its essences, although changing essences. But the vehicle of those changing essences, the vehicle of the thought, the thing which is having the thoughts, is what is meant by the cogitans itself, or the ego itself. But to Kant, that's a very logical, abstract sort of notion about which relatively little is known, other than the fact that it's the thing which is having the thoughts. But he thinks that is Kant thinks that is faithful to what Descartes was trying to talk about in the Meditations specifically. Anyway, the other thing to understand here is, with philosophical definition, right? Very often in philosophy, the definition is not the starting point of the investigation, it's the ending point of the investigation. You're trying to arrive at the adequate or correct definition of something. In math, you're often laying down a definition and then seeing what follows from it, and you're always reasoning forward from the definition. In philosophy, you're often reasoning to the definition, in the sense that you're trying to arrive at an understanding or set of mental structures or formulas for something that are meant to be adequate to explain the case, something like that. But you're only arriving at them at the end of the investigation. It's not where you start out from. So in that sense, philosophical definitions are often judged by, how well they explain things, what they entail, et cetera, whether or not they fit together with, other things you're trying to explain, how much is overall explained by the whole structure you're laying out, whatever, rather than, do I accept the axiom? Because otherwise I'm not going to accept any of the reasoning that depends upon the axiom, which is okay in geometry, but sort of backwards for how philosophy usually proceeds. Just a remark on the definition side of that.
Well, maybe if we have time at the end, I'll tell you some specifics. Things that I actually think would have buttressed Heidegger's argument even more strongly about interacting with the world if his view of visual perception was worked out better. So, but I don't want to go down that rabbit hole right now. Obviously, you want to present this, but at the end,
Sure.
if we have time, I'll ask some specifics, and you could tell me
Sure.
what you think.
Sure. And for many of that, I mean, he's not trying to give an explanation of visual perception here, right? There's places where he does say, this is related to visual perception, but if you want a detailed phenomenological explication of visual perception, I would go back to Husserl or forward to Merleau-Ponty rather than looking for it here. But it's just not the topic in that kind of detail. But So we can definitely get to those questions later. Pete, you want to give first reactions? And also anything you want to focus on to explain?
For in the early parts, I liked the Kant or Heidegger's definition of transcendental, and the use of, I thought it was really clear compared to some others, and then I used that to explain what the res cogitans meant in Descartes, and then Heidegger, carefully using his language so to make sure he separated the subject from Dasein, and that the two won't be confused together. And then in the later parts, it wasn't new to me, but I liked some of the passages where Heidegger was explaining, where he was going with his critique.
Mm-hmm. I want to focus on one thing you mentioned, which is how clear he is about transcendent or transcendental. And it is one of the things which is challenging here, just because there's at least 5 different versions of what that is about running around, right, in different thinkers. And most of what he's explaining here, he's following what Kant means by it. But by the end of this book, he will be explaining his own version of transcendent, which is going to be disagreeing rather sharply from Kant's version of it. And in between, there's the Husserl version of what transcendent means, which isn't the same thing as Kant's. And it's also useful to know that before even the Kantian version of transcendent or transcendental, there's a medieval scholastic version of transcendental, which is, partly, I wouldn't even say it's the basis of Kant's ones. Kant's is in a different direction, but he's very much aware of the sort of medieval scholastic version of the transcendentals. And then even that version goes back to like ancient philosophy stuff, which maybe in Plato, but also in sort of the Neoplatonic thought, right? Had a notion of transcendent or transcendental, which might be closer to the modern New Agey notion of metaphysical or something like that.
I need a class handout of the taxonomy.
Yeah, so I'm gonna let's go in the opposite. Let's go from transcendent. Transcendent can mean transcendent over the material or visible world. That's sort of the original old metaphysical notion, where it means metaphysics as opposed to physics or something like that. That's not what it means to the medievals. To the medievals, although it may be an origin point for some of the medievals, for the medievals, a concept is a transcendental if it applies to either side of the distinction between finite and infinite being. In other words, if it applies to finite and infinite being equally, it is a transcendental concept. Things like being, good, one, true, all of those are transcendental concepts, but for them, they're transcendental concepts because they apply before you make the distinction between finite beings and God. They apply to beings indifferently, even if before that distinction is made. That's the sort of Duns Scotus era notion of what it means for a concept to be transcendental. In Kant, it's transcendent with respect to experience in a particular way, and it means not the content of an experience, but the condition for the possibility of that experience, right? And that's really what he means by transcendental in Kant, and it's closely connected to this notion of reasoning a priori, or reasoning before experience, right? So something which can be known without reference to experience is a transcendental thing to Kant because it is a condition for the possibility of the experience, or for how we think about the experience, or something like that. And he has a whole elaborate, notion of what pure philosophy or pure reason is about, that it is especially focused on things that we don't know empirically, but that we know or assume or project before any empirical experience. Things which, you know, the logical positivists would call logical structure of thought or something like that would fall into that category. But it's a more expansive category for Kant than just like logic. But the point is, transcendent for Kant is mostly directed as transcendent compared to empirical experience, something like that. And then in Husserl, right, you get the notion of transcendent where it's transcendent with respect to the consciousness, meaning what the consciousness intends as being outside the consciousness. It's related to his notion of intentionality. This is the notion you get in Husserl, so that the object over there, right, that I'm related to, that sofa, is transcendent in the sense that the intentional meaning my mind has put there is not of an experience, it's not of a set of colors, but it's meant to be something that I'm pointing to and positing outside of my consciousness. So transcendent with respect to the consciousness, outside the consciousness, objective world in some sense, is what the meaning of transcendent is to Husserl, right? And Heidegger is going to have yet another one, which I don't want to completely spoil because we don't really get to it until first part of part two here, about what he means by transcendent, where for him transcendent is the thing which is transcendent is not the sofa, but the Dasein mind that has already understood the sofa, right? In other words, he's not thinking that the sofa is transcendent over the mind, but there's something about mindliness which has the ability to transcend in it. So the transcendent thing for Heidegger is the Dasein, not the sofa. So is the transcendent thing the Dasein? Is the transcendent thing the sofa? Is the transcendent thing the condition of the possible experience of the sofa as the intuitive forms of space and time? Is the transcendent the categories that the sofa has in common with God, like being and oneness and things like this? Or is transcendent only something which is metaphysical or beyond the physical, right? That's a whole tissue of different possible meanings of transcendent, right? And if you don't know who's speaking and what era they're speaking in, it can be very hard to tell which one of them is meant. The part that he's explaining in this chapter is mostly Kant's version of that. He's mostly explaining Kant's notion of transcendent, but you have to keep in mind that Husserl's notion of transcendent is definitely hovering around there, because for Husserl, transcendent was intentionality reveals the transcendent as what the mind intends as not simply being the mind. The mind is not trying to think about itself. The mind is trying to think about the world in which it is. And that particular move is one which actually sharply distinguishes Husserl and Heidegger on the one hand from Kant on the other. Kant is much more willing to treat all sensuous intuitions as mere appearances, as things which are part of the interior of consciousness, right? All of our evidence for them is only appearances. So what they are is appearances. And as appearances, they're already thought-like to Kant. That's why he's a transcendental idealist, right? He's finding the ideaness in things, including materials or empirical experience. He's understanding empirical experience as an appearance, right? And thus an appearance to, and thus something already thought-like. So for him, something isn't transcendent because it's material, something isn't transcendent because it is thought-like, because even the material things are thought-like, right? What is transcendent is in this different sort of logical direction of, instead of it being the empirical content of experience, it's prior to experience. It's structuring or organizing experience without being an experienced thing itself. That's sort of what transcendent means to Kant, right?
Can I ask you a quick question?
Absolutely, ask the questions.
Forgive for the neophyte part of it, maybe.
No problem.
If I understood what you said correctly, for Husserl, transcendent means whatever is not the mind.
It primarily means what the mind intends as not being part of the mind. So in Husserl.
Yeah,
So,
okay, it's just in Husserl, yes.
Husserl is someone who starts from the experience of consciousness as the place where all of our data comes from, so to speak, right? All of our data is consciousness-like, but the data of consciousness itself doesn't say consciousness is everything. In other words, even looked at from the inside, the mind is not an idealist. The mind is a realist, right? The mind wants to be thinking about things outside of itself. And Husserl insists upon taking that intention of the mind seriously, whereas someone like a Kant might think that that could be full of illusion and doubt it. Husserl does not doubt it. So in that sense, whenever there is a sort of a logical intention or meaning laid down by the experience itself about what this experience is supposed to be about, right? Husserl treats that as the truth about that thing. And he does this for the same reason that in logical or mathematical reasoning, you're allowed to define your variables or lay down stipulations as what you mean by X. So the sofa that I intend over there that is in the room with me is not a collection of gray experiences on my retina, right? And that for the same reason that if I tell you that let X equal this thing over here, you can't substitute some Y that I didn't put down. I didn't mean the collection of, gray pattern things on my retina when I told you sofa over there. I meant the thing which is actually in the room with me, right? And so in the same way that naming is logically free, right, for Husserl, the mental intentions of the mind as to what it means to be experiencing and reasoning about are truths laid down prior to all other reasoning about them. And they're stipulated. And to disagree with them is simply to not listen to the person you're talking to or to the mind you're attempting to understand. But anyway, all that's Husserl, right? That's Husserl's take on these things. Sorry, Joe, question.
Yeah, I just want to clarify. So I'm sitting at my desk, I'm looking across the room to the sofa, and sofa's there, okay? But the sofa, as time goes by, time is a thing we haven't mentioned, as time goes by, it will disintegrate and become junk and eventually dust. But I'm sitting here and I'm thinking sofa, and as long as it looks adequate to me, it's sofa. But then I have the concept of sofa, and I can distinguish by, for example, getting a new one delivered. And that would have to be a deliberate intentional thing. Now I have something that fits the category of sofa very nicely, but is not transcendent. It came in. What transcends is my idea.
So the first of all, Husserl will entirely agree with you that the thing that you intend as that is in the room with you when you call it the sofa is some spatially and temporally extended thing that is not simply reducible to your experiences, right? And it can enter into causal relationships with things, including you, right? So it is always it always has potentiality all around it, and so forth. Things are not mere collections of words, right? And they're also not mere collections of experiences. They're not ways of referring to collections of experiences as some of the logical positivists would have them, right? But you will not succeed in getting a blueprint of a sofa delivered to your house that has not been instantiated to Husserl, right? So the idea of the sofa and the sofa are not the same thing to Husserl. So sofas are experiential realities, and they're not plans of sofas. But anyway, that's just sort of standard phenomenology, that you get in Husserl, Heidegger's teacher, even before you get to Heidegger himself. The thing about all that is to understand just this word transcendent. None of that would be to Kant what he means by transcendent, right? For him, the sofa is not a transcendent, but something like the space in which you have to imagine the possible sofa is transcendent, right? Because before you have any experience, you have some interior, already programmed in mental map of spatial awareness into which the things that you can actually experience or intuit is always already put. And a structure like that is what Kant means by transcendent. Precisely because it is transcendent, not just over the one sofa in front of you, but over all the possible sofas. You always put your possible sofas and your actual sofas in your mental map of space. Your mental map of space is transcendent over your experiences. So that's the meaning that Kant gives to transcendent. Does that help? Okay, we were still doing first reactions. These are all great questions. Jeff, I heard some of your first reactions of you got through only the first part and parts of it seemed incomprehensible, but you're underlining the parts you already understood. Were the Kantian pieces comprehensible because of the Kant you've already had, or?
Well, yeah, they did basically match. But I hadn't read the second critique, so that part I just sort of assumed that he was right. But the rest of it, it worked. I'm very much, sorry. I'm very into Latour as well, and he definitely talks about this same kind of divide between things that think and the natural world, which is supposedly just an object that doesn't have any interior. So that seemed like review as well. I don't know. I am kind of formulating my thoughts of what my objections are to maybe not Heidegger particularly, although I don't think he's a good writer, but to ontology. I think, and maybe you could just address this along the way, because I don't want to, this is going to be the topic of the meeting, of course. But for me, where I'm at, my last thread for ontology is basically, does it make sense to address what is before you do the thing? I know, so to me, the what is really comes after, at least for us non-metaphysical people. It's like the meaning of is comes out of its many, many uses in explaining actual things. And the only real, it's everything, the form of everything seems so deductive. And the only thing that he's deducing from are these like very ordinary experiences of like, staring at your table or whatever. And it's certain, and he, to his credit, he expands it to some other experiences like that happen between people, like care and respect. So there is that, but it's just like it's trying to figure out what is, when I think the is really the last question that get answered. You're going to try and generalize over a mass of things, and that's kind of what he's doing with Kant, right? Because what I remember from Kant, he doesn't talk much about this. He doesn't speak in terms of ontology. You have to glean it, which of course is Heidegger's favorite thing to do. But why is it that then should we start with Heidegger's reflections on being, or should we do what he does and see what people say about a lot of stuff and then sort of infer what they're meaning about being? And then even I don't know what to do with the results of that anyway, because it's at the end of the whole process. So that's my impression of the
Sure.
whole.
So the place where this is at least imminent in Kant is places where he says things like the psychological person is just a thing, right? There's some notion of what it means to be a thing there as opposed to a person that Kant is already operating from that can lead him to say something like that. And that's the sort of thing that Heidegger is trying to tease out. Why would he say that? Why is there nothing thought-like or subject-like about the psychological man? And I think he's onto something there. I think that it is, you have to see, it's like a motivated judgment, if I can put it that way, in Kant. And similarly, when Kant says you cannot know anything about the transcendental person, about the synthetic unity of apperception, we'll get to all this farther along, but when he says you can't say anything about it because it's a purely formal X, like the thing in itself, right? There's a kind of model of the unknowable thing in itself with its knowable powers or properties there that seems to be taken from things and applied to the transcendental ego. And
it feels, in psychological terms, it feels like a version of the fundamental attribution error, right? Where basically we say that, oh, you do this because you think this all the time. But I think though it's really, when you really get down to it, it's going to be generally, there's some parts that seem clear, and you can make this idea of what someone's the conditions from which they're speaking or whatever, but they're not going to be uniform. It's going to work for something, and then you're going to say, okay, you do this all the time. I find myself doing, we all do it. I mean, it's probably just a matter of computational bandwidth and wanting the world to be simpler than it actually is. So I don't know. I think yeah, it's there, but that's something you could do afterward, and then I mean, I don't think
I'm not quite getting the afterward. I mean,
well.
obviously he's going through, all of these different philosophers in history and seeing the places where they had a meaning they ascribed to being, and looking at anything that might be, put it this way, limited or partial or bug-like about it, that is dependent upon an unanalyzed piece of the previous tradition, right? Something like that. The other one that definitely comes up in this chapter about Kant is a place where he says, of course, people can't understand themselves because they didn't make themselves. Only their creator can understand something. He's sort of measuring self-understanding against the possible understanding that he imagines God has of the things that it has created. And Heidegger notices this and sees that there is a continuity there with a understanding of being as producedness going back to Plato. So there's at a time when when Kant thinks of himself as overthrowing a Platonic dogmatism, with his critical critical move on all previous dogmatic philosophy, there's a place where that same not only dogmatism but the particular dogma is there in Kant himself, specifically about the knowability of the ego.
Well, I think I can backtrack a little bit, because I think it is true that if one way to put a wedge in the way things are is to make people rethink their basic concepts. So that there's sort of a synergy going on. You have a lot of experiences, and then you make sort of one of these sweeping ontological generalizations, and then that shapes the way you do things forward. So then now you're even more into that, and then someone says, okay, well, but that sweeping generalization wasn't right, actually, because really people are in the world. They're not just objects. That'll be the one to come, right?
Sure.
So that basically you have that thing. So then you can kind of interrupt that thing. But I think that the doing of that it requires. I mean, this is only the first step. Maybe this is why I like people who are influenced by Heidegger so much than Heidegger, because the rubber finally hits the road.
I understand. I'm just trying to point out that as a method, it's not unproductive of insights, right? Noticing these points in Kant, right, and how they seem to fit with the diagnosis of why he winds up there. It does seem to come up with interesting things to notice about Kant, which you might not have expected. But
maybe that's the problem then, because he's doing the history. So when he's diagnosing our current set of being, then yeah, that has the potential to change. But I'm fairly familiar with history, so it's always sort of like, and he's like, look, if you thought about it, they would have made this done before. No, it's not enough. It's just a bare bone. It's a sketch. It's interesting story. But yeah. So maybe that's why the later parts, as Craig pointed out, are more interesting, because he's diagnosing our current conception of being. Yeah, that has potential.
Giving his own, but yeah. I mean, in his day, right, neo-Kantianism was all the rage, and most of the people around him were one or another specimen of Kantian, right? And that may be less true now, but it was true then. So anyway, just useful. Nick, do you want to give first reactions to the chapter, or any things you want to make sure that we focus on and talk about when we go through it?
Yeah, I thought I thought this chapter was very rich, and I do think it's to be able to really get something out of it, I have to read it 2 or 3 times. but there's a lot in it. I mean, he does unpack Kant in a good way, like the ego. When he talks about it, he breaks it up into three types: the transcendental, which is closer to Kant's unity of apperception, if you will, just essentially a subject. And then there's not psychological, but maybe personality or whatever. That
yes,
has to do with
the
more
psychological
empirical,
person, and then
yeah,
the moral person is the
yeah,
third. Yeah.
but in this way of talking about it, he talks about the ego as subject versus ego as object, which is kind of very helpful in understanding and breaking it up, so forth. And then he goes into the moral side, which has to be with ego as, I think, subject and object also. But anyway, this is a great way of unpacking, because there is a part of Kant that says that we know ourselves also as appearance. Now, even the ego that we know of ourselves is to ourselves also appearance. And this, I take it, is very close to when he talks about here, ego as object rather than ego as subject, so forth. Anyway, that's the way I'm interpreting it. And then there's a lot of like the idea of the I act. I think it talks about it rather than the I think. That was rich, I thought. Quite a lot that helps you read the idea of when he talks about feeling, for instance, in the you know, Kant has a very cold categorical imperative thing of what is true and so forth. But here he puts life into it and attaches it to feeling. It has to do with feeling, and that to me is kind of another insight that, you know, he has a lot of nuanced views of Kant that makes it very, very nice to try to understand and reread.
I get it. So we're
Yeah.
definitely going to get to all those different pieces of
Right,
Kant,
right.
because it's definitely a
Okay.
powerful analysis there. I mean, the feeling part is he's especially talking about the phenomenology of the feeling of respect,
Right.
which he discusses in the course of the moral personality and the to act part. The part we were talking about the appearance to ourselves is there in the psychological personality, which is sort of your thoughts as things that happen to you, not as things that you do, something like that.
Right.
The sort of passive view of the stream of your intellect. And of that, Kant says that it is a thing, not just that it's an appearance, but that it is a thing. He kind of differentiates it from the mind-like.
When you say thing, are you referring to thing in itself or just a thing?
He's actually distinguishing it from being like a person.
Okay, I get it. Yeah. Right.
He's saying there's something matter-like, animal-like, and not full person-like about the passive intellect, something like that.
All right, that's good too, because I missed that in the reading. Now, the other thing about the moral part is that in Kant, when it comes to morality, the ego is the part, the I that is no longer appearance, but I that is noumenal, I believe. And so I think he also underscores it here here the
yes, and that's related to what we just said, right? I mean, he thinks that the morally acting ego actually is and isn't just an appearance and isn't just a thing. It's a person. And this is part of his understanding of what humanity is. Humanity has a dignity to it for Kant because of the possibility of moral action that to him it doesn't have just as a passively experienced animal, right? And the reason that the feeling aspect of respect matters there is it's easy to assume that if anything is feeling, then it's passive, and if anything is feeling and passive as caused, it's machine-like, or there's a notion of the spontaneity or freedom of the person that could easily be seen as being opposite to feeling as something which can be passively played upon by whatever forces are causing the feeling. And for in the analysis of the phenomenology of respect, what Heidegger is bringing out is that Kant is saying there is something feeling like that is not passive at all. It's a feeling like that is part and parcel of the free spontaneity of the subject, something like that. And this is sort of the point where you could say Kant is closest to being sort of moral stoicism, something like that, or moral heroism. There's a place there where Heidegger says that what respect is not being willing to diss the hero in our soul, or something like that. He doesn't say diss, but you get the point. But we have to come to that. All of these things are interesting, both because they're a place where Kant is giving a kind of psychological phenomenology that Husserl or Heidegger would be proud of, right? And he's sort of bringing that out. But it's also useful for diagnosing a few things about Kant himself that maybe not be what Heidegger is stressing here. Kant doesn't have a lot of respect for the animal man, as opposed to the moral man. And you have to see what might or might not follow from that. The human being who does not act according to the categorical imperative, in what regard does Kant view him? It's a question to ask.
The last thing is the second part of this, which is the part where he starts talking about being in the world, that sort of thing. I was kind of I kind of was wondering if this was written before or after, because the neologism.
It's one hour. It's 1 year after being in time, basically.
But the terms that he created, the neologisms in being in time, aren't really used here in the X-ray, like ready to hand, or present to hand. Those are not in this. Those terms aren't used.
A little bit of it is. He does talk about the equivalent contexture here as part of it.
So you think
he uses
a year after being in time?
It's a year after. It's a year after. It's not before. And there are places where he's, if I can put it this way, using a deliberately narrower portion of the new vocabulary to make it more comprehensible. He's not expecting people to, get the whole machinery, but he's introducing to him critical pieces. The critical pieces here in the second half of the chapter would be being in the world, the idea of the world at all, and the idea of equipment, which is sort of where anything like being to hand or ready to hand comes in. And then in the next chapter, it's going to be about truth is unveiledness and something like being in the truth. But he's trying to get as far as he can, if I can put it this way, with just the structures of being in the world and being in the truth, without needing to go into all the phenomenology of care or any of the other things you get in greater detail in being in time. And it's of some interest that they're kind of enough to carry the argument, right?
It's very good. I think I like his treatment of it here better than just the way he treated it at being in time. And this is supposed to be, remind me again, a sequel or a part of being in time that he didn't.
I mean, sort of. I mean, he never wrote the promise, a later part of being in time, right? Instead, we got this and his book on Kant and the problem of metaphysics.
Kant and metaphysics. Yeah.
And those sort of have to stand in for it. But in every one of these, well, not every one of these, in this one too, right? He lays out a whole project with the 3 parts that this is going to have, and he gets to the beginning of part 2, and the fact that a structure has been projected in a previous work of Heidegger does not mean that his subsequent works are going to fill it out, because he's going to have another idea before he gets to the end of it, and he's going to go somewhere else. Sorry, Joe.
I thought that when we first started this series here on Heidegger, on this book, that somewhere the information floated past me that this was a lecture that he gave sort of live at the university. Yes. and that his lecture notes were then written into what we see in front of us. Probably by him, but did he give this lecture like one unique time the year after he published Being in Time, or is this a lecture he's repeated earlier?
This is like 2 semesters after. It's like a 1 semester long course. And he did give it as a course. The actual text we have has 2 different sources. One is his actual lecture notes that he lectured from, but the other is one of his students took shorthand notes of the lectures as he gave them. And much later, like in the 70s, these 2 were compiled together, the transcribed shorthand written out into longhand and the lecture notes, and anything that appeared in either one was sort of turned into the German text that this was translated from. So
yeah, but there's no reason to believe that it was being sequential.
Sorry?
When he was doing Being in Time.
This is a lecture course was given a year after Being in Time was published.
Right.
So this is definitely after Being in Time. And in terms of this actual book as we have it, right, that actual text wasn't written down in exactly that form as text until way later, like decades later.
Okay.
But a year after Being in Time, a copy of shorthand notes of him having said this, right, or of his lecture notes if he was planning to say this in the class, right, existed as 2 separate documents, right? So in terms of the sort of historical source authenticity, right, that dates from a year after Being in Time. Pete, did I miss anything there about the history? I know you know this stuff.
No, and so we know that he laid out Being in Time. He laid out the sections he intended, and one of them was to go back through Scholastic and Kant and Descartes and destructure them. And that's what he's doing in this first section. So in a sense, he's still working on his Being in Time project. But within a year, he's going to stop that entirely because he's changed his mind about some things. And there's also a few other lectures shortly before Being in Time, or these connecting semesters, where you can also see that he's fleshing out some of the intended parts of Being in Time. So this isn't the only one that's related to or seems to be fleshing out Being in Time.
Yep, all fair. I mean, the other thing I'll just mention is at the very start of this one, he's laying out his own structure, which isn't simply listing it as being part 2 of Being in Time. And he doesn't finish that one either. But this is, the point is, much of the subject matter here, and also the Kant and the problem of metaphysics subject matter, is stuff that was pointed to by the original Being in Time plan. So fair questions. Dan, do you want to give first reactions to things in the chapter, or things that you want us to make sure we cover as we go through it?
Sure, but I think I really like what you said, and you explained about the transcendent, what it meant the different thinkers and Heidegger. And I think what I would like to say is, like, I think for example, in Husserl, it was something you mentioned, it was intentionality, and it was something subjective. And I think Heidegger will disagree completely with that, and he kind of replaced that with some kind of projection or meaning in his project, and that's not something subjective. And then when compared with Kant, like in Kant we have this transcendence, like you say, some a priori structure that makes possible all the experience. And I think what Heidegger will later in a way takes from that, it's being, like he puts, but being is like in Kant, all this transcendence is something inside our mind, is subjective, and for Heidegger, he's going to put being, and being it's totally prior to beings, but it's no longer in our mind, it's there in our world. And we have this kind of unique directions. We can move from being to beings, but not from beings to being. And I think when you mentioned that to me, it's kind of struck me that probably he kind of took that from Kant, but it's in a different way. It's in the world, or being, it's out there, it's no longer in our mind, like in Kant, what this transcendent. And then in Heidegger, you mentioned it's transcendent to him is Dasein, and I think that to me that was one of the most difficult concepts to grasp in Heidegger, and it's kind of crucial what Dasein mean, that it's not the subject, it's not the human being, it's something there, something distinct that put us in contact with there, it's being there, it moves us outside ourselves and places us in the world. And in this kind of what Dasein means is we are already in touch with what's there in the world. There is no distance, like in, I don't know, in truthed correspondence, it's that distance between us and beings. While Dasein is there, it's directly with beings and with whatever it is. I just some kind of clarifications to what you said. That's all.
So I mostly agree with that, but I mean, I want to be clear. Dasein is the being that we each ourselves are. It's not something we have, right? As for the question of how subjective Husserl is trying to move from a purely subjective understanding of consciousness to a more objective understanding of consciousness. That's sort of why he's founding phenomenology. But Heidegger is definitely farther along on that road. The other thing to say, though, is there's even in this chapter, there's a place where he imagines someone having the criticism of what he's saying about being in the world, that it is too subjectivist and too idealist. And he says, but this isn't a very cogent objection. First of all, it's not true that it's just the subject as we understood it before. Maybe we were understanding anything like a subject more originally than subject-object distinction understands them. And then he says, but even if it were proven that this were idealism, that wouldn't be an argument against it, because nowhere is it written that idealism is false or realism is true. And he goes on to this sort of mini rant about how it may be according to the fashion of some period of time, it may be an adroit rhetorical move to denounce something as idealism, but this is not philosophical thought at all, something like that. So he's perfectly willing to be thought of as an idealist about the way he's explaining being in the world. That doesn't mean that he is an idealist in the Kantian sense or something like that, but he's going to reject completely the thinking that if you can find idealism in something, you've refuted it. He is violently opposed to that way of doing philosophy. But anyway, in terms of what being means, we'll get to some of that at the beginning of part 2 here. But and it's certainly a main quarry on whose track we are, so to speak. But that Dasein is always already with beings and directly with beings is not only something which is for Heidegger a phenomenological fact about Dasein, but it's also something like the right way to understand what we mean by being in the first place. It's not meant to be a deduction so much as a definition, if I can put it that way, although there's also an observation behind it. So it is worth tracking what Heidegger means by beings and what Descartes means by cogitations, and seeing how much they might correspond. If you want to decide how idealist or not idealist Heidegger is, you have to see whether or not his beings are things which previously people called thoughts. Joe?
Yeah, back to my fascination with words, and I'm very much a junior learner here. So naively speaking, idealism could be interpreted or misinterpreted as Plato in the cave or something, in which ideas, forms, and so forth are all out there in the ideal world and float around like objects. I mean, I'm confused about the term idealism.
Idealism has different meanings in different contexts, but its general meaning here is something like the fundamental constituent things that are in the world are thought-like. Right? That's idealism. There's lots of ways you can arrive at idealism, right? There can be different, flavors of idealism. You can have transcendental idealism, and you can have, theistic idealism, and you can have, whatever, maybe Platonic idealism. But idealism is something like things that are thought like. That's naively is idealism. And realism, in contrast, would be something like things that are more like matter than they are like thoughts, and thoughts are more like epiphenomena of than they are like fundamental realities, something like that. Yeah, so I mean, again, lots of flavors and nuances. These things are possible because people arrive at positions like that for different reasons. And you'll say, yes, I agree that the things which are thought like, but here's how they're thought like, and here's what I mean by a thought, right? And if I do that, you can get rather far from what someone might naively come to it thinking. But someone like a Berkeley is a outright idealist. Hegel is an outright idealist. He'll tell you he's an idealist, and he'll tell you that all the things that minds experiences were made by minds, right? And that the whole is concept, right? That's just straightforward idealism. So we use terms like that, especially across philosophies, to distinguish strong positions like that from others, because they're self-identifications. They're how someone wants to be understood. Does that help?
Yeah, is that primarily also in the pre-existing ontological categories of that we talked about? The race cogitans would have that approach to it.
Right. So I mean, someone like a how to put it, Leibniz thinks of himself as an idealist, and he's a Cartesian in the sense that he thinks there's res extensia and res cogitans, but he thinks that the fundamental constituent parts of the world are mind-like monads that all think.
That almost makes them sound like Dasein from Heidegger.
Well,
there must be important
there are places here where Heidegger mentions what he thinks was a real insight in Leibniz that way, but Leibniz's reasons for thinking that are not Heidegger's reasons for thinking that, and he is taking it way farther than Heidegger would, in ways that are farther from common sense than Heidegger would take them. Heidegger is not an idealist in that sense. Heidegger thinks that he knows that tables don't think. Because for Heidegger, tables are interworldly. They have no world. And Dasein always already has a world. And that distinction is a real phenomenologically grounded fundamental ontology difference for Heidegger. And in that, he's assuming that we know tables don't think. And Leibniz knows nothing of the kind. Right? Carlos?
Question regarding Dasein, and I realize this is something that could be beaten to death over years, but as a person, I have a mind, a body, a history, and an environment in which I live. Is that my Dasein?
Your Dasein is not something you have, but something you are.
Okay, yeah, that posed the wrong question. Is that something that is what I am? Is Dasein?
The claim is something like you are a there being or a being there that is always equipped with a world, a past, a future, care, angst, intention, understanding, and you are a place or site where being happens.
And that is a very individual Dasein. You would ascribe a different Dasein to each one of us.
Well, the fact that we're using the same term and the fact that I just said all those things confidently means that there has to be something universal about it, which is true of humanity as such.
Oh,
but hang on, let me finish. But it is certainly the case that Dasein, our existence, is in each case mine.
All right, so
I cannot think your thoughts, and I cannot have your experiences.
Software-like, Dasein is a class and we're instantiations?
To Heidegger, he is more individualistic than even a particularist like Aristotle. and the existent entities are first.
Oh.
So Daseins are first, and anything like a class of Daseins is second. A Platonist who might agree with him about all these other things about Dasein might think that there is some universal form that all Daseins must conform to and instantiate such that they can have this in common with one another, and it cannot possibly be an accident, right? But that's something a Platonist would bring to this that Heidegger himself hasn't put there. So I'm not deciding between those two for you, but I'm trying to explain to you, Heidegger is not committed to the idea that Dasein is an idea in a Platonic sense. For him, Daseins are, they're one of the things that are, they're one of the basic categories of existent things. And they're certainly not just an idea for him.
Okay. Yeah, thanks.
He does entertain, even in this chapter, thoughts like, if there were no Dasein in existence, and he says, interworldly beings would still be. Interworldly beings do not need Dasein to exist in order to be. And this also can distinguish him from various kinds of idealists, right?
But there has to be a mind associated with Dasein.
There at least has to be an awareness of being associated with Dasein.
Right.
How much of that is mind? He isn't really talking about mind. He's talking about Dasein instead. For him, Dasein is deeper than anything like what Descartes would call mind, and it's more fundamental than anything that Husserl would call consciousness. You're Dasein even when you're asleep, right? So it's not simply consciousness in any waking sense of consciousness. A cognitive science person would say it's more natural, more nature-like, more fundamental than a surface experience, something like that. But again, it's a hard concept because it's one of the core concepts to Heidegger, but he starts with it in these very formal ways, which are readily intuitable and meant to be intuitable, which is Dasein is the kind of being that each of us is, each of us are. And he expects you to, as a good phenomenologist, learn things about Dasein from direct inspection, not to take his word for it, right? Do listen to him as he tries to, point to the phenomena that he wants you to experience, but the evidence of what Dasein is like, you should be able to see for yourself without listening to him pontificate about it.
You have to, by his definition, by the way you're describing it, the only
communication consists in him pointing these things out to you and you verifying them for yourselves by direct inspection from his communication.
He doesn't have my intentionality. I'm the only one who has my intentionality.
Sure, he can't think for you, but he can point things out for you to think.
Right.
So there's a whole notion of what communication is, and how one Dasein can inform the experiences of another in all of this. But in all of that, you cannot think his thoughts. You can only use his indications to go look at what he looked at when he had his thoughts. If that helps.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, that gets into the struggle that I was having when we got into that. As we started reading through the last 20 pages, this image came up of a newborn child. Mm-hmm. And a newborn child doesn't know squat about what a table is. A newborn child only has needs to replace the fact that the umbilical cord's been cut off. He's now breathing air instead of amniotic fluid. He's now cold because he.
Do you know this from personal experience?
Yeah. Yeah, you do those little regression times, but everything that he's saying that we become with the sign, we become through our interaction. We learn what a table is in interaction with other people. We learn how to speak in interaction with other people. We learn how to grow up with other people. So it's the starting point of being a full adult is different than dealing with the developmental stages. And
but he's not trying to do developmental psychology here, and he doesn't care about full adult, right? He is going to say that if there isn't yet a world there, there isn't yet a Dasein there.
So when do we?
He doesn't care. All your questions about where and whether or not dogs and all, he doesn't care. It's an empirical matter for him. Let the sciences go find out. It's not a philosophical matter. The philosophical matter is the difference between things that have a world and things that don't. That's a philosophical matter. It's a matter of fundamental ontology. Theories about causation about it, go have a physical science about it. He doesn't care. Not his field. He's not trying to decide those questions because they don't matter. What matters to him, what matters to him is the fundamental ontology question of what beings are, what beings that have worlds are, and what beings that don't have worlds are. That he thinks only philosophy can answer.
Yeah, that's where I probably diverge with him, because at some point, how do we get from one to the other of the child to the person who he
well,
is?
I'll tell you a way in which this is related. So if you go back to Leibniz, right? Why does Leibniz think that tables think? Right? There's no evidence that tables think, but Leibniz has an argument that makes him, invent his monads. And his argument is he cannot see how to get consciousness as an emergent phenomena. And because his imagination fails to find a way of getting consciousness as emergent phenomena, and consciousness is phenomenal, it has to have a cause. He doesn't see how he can get its cause from things which aren't, which don't think. He thinks there must be thought all the way down. If I can't get thought somewhere from things that don't think, then there has to be thought all the way down. That's Leibniz's direct reasoning for monads.
Yeah, which is what a lot of consciousness studies are doing at the same time now too.
And this is not where Heidegger comes out, and it's not even a kind of reasoning that he is interested in, right? Because the phenomena of consciousness, or of not even consciousness, before consciousness, the phenomena of having a world, the phenomena of being appearing to, is to him more fundamental, and understanding that is the basis of philosophical understanding in general, including understanding any of these concepts, or understanding anything like emergence, or understanding what a category is, or understanding what an extant thing is, or an interworldly thing is, or understanding what causality is, or understanding whether or not you know something if you've made it, right? All of those sorts of things are to him philosophical questions. And you may think the scientific question is the burning question, and only the scientific question can answer the philosophical question. He is absolutely 100% committed to the opposite of that answer. He doesn't think that the philosophy has to learn from the science at it. He thinks that if anyone's sitting at anyone's feet, it's the other way around.
Yeah, so I would consider that a severe divergence that I have with Heidegger.
It can be. I'm just explaining where he is, right?
Yeah.
He's not a
I'll be right back, gentlemen.
not a scientistic philosopher, right? He does, yeah. He doesn't think of himself as being anti anything the sciences have to learn on that, but he's not a scientistic philosopher, and he doesn't think that philosophy has to go learn from the scientists what is philosophically true. He thinks that philosophically true is accessible to the mind as the mind. Okay, if you just think clearly enough, which is hard, obviously. All right, we've done a bunch of initial reactions. It was all great stuff. Raised great questions. I want to get through some expository stuff on the content of the chapter. We've touched on a bunch of the different pieces along the way. We haven't gone through it sort of in order. the first thing I want to mention is he gives a sort of little capsule history. And along the way, he's got all kinds of little historical asides. Little capsule history, he starts off with this claim that although modern ontology is going to make much of this res cogitans, he's going to say, does that mean that it goes straight away, tells us what's different about the kind of beings that think are and how they're different from other beings? And he says nothing of the kind happens. Strong claim. He claims that there is fundamental continuity in the notions of being that are used in modern ontology and in the concepts in Suarez that we saw in the previous chapter. He'll try to, at the moment, that's just a claim. He'll try to bring it out a little bit when he gets to some of the criticisms of Kant. But and what's interesting here is there's places in later Heidegger where he'll claim that, you know, the history of modern philosophy from Descartes down to Hegel is the history of consummate subjectivity, right? It's the rise of this consummate subjectivity idea. But here he's insisting instead that the fundamental notion of being is the same in Descartes as it is in Suarez, and they haven't managed to move it. So it's the continuity with the previous tradition, not some subjectivist break with the previous tradition, which here comes in for criticism. They haven't made the progress they've claimed they've made with any modern revolution that has changed the focus of the subject. Okay, and from Heidegger's point of view, that's because they may have focused on consciousness, but they haven't asked the being question about consciousness originally enough, something like that. And instead, they give us a subject and object, which is a particular modern way of understanding this distinction. Okay, so big general background in that little historical aside there, there's a big giant criticism of subject-object distinction thinking as the characteristic modern problem, the characteristic modern way of trying to understand consciousness or something like ourselves, that he thinks is not going to get the right answer, in part because it's too dependent, without recognizing it, on the categories of being of the previous traditional ontology. Okay, don't know if that's true. It's just a claim at that stage, but recognize the claim. And then he says, you know, we could start this discussion of what goes on in this understanding of mind-like being, something like that, from Descartes where it originates, or from Hegel where it culminates, but I choose instead to start it from the decisive intermediary between them, Kant. And there's a certain arbitrariness to this, right? He already knew he was going to do Kant, right? But this chapter could easily have been written quite differently about Descartes, or it could have been written also quite differently about Hegel. Either one of them would have been people who told him that, you know, understanding the things which think are the central thing for modern philosophy. But he picks Kant in between them instead. Kant, who is the person who is going to reject even the Cartesian move as still dogmatic in favor of criticism. We'll come to that in a second. But also as the originator of German idealism, but not yet all the way off in the full-blown Hegel version of German idealism. Okay, so he picked Kant. He didn't really tell you why he picked Kant. He just calls him the decisive intermediary stage. And he's sort of expecting that you already know, you know, enough, you know, storylines of modern philosophy to know why he's pivotal. Okay, all that's just his intro to why he picked, or that he picked Kant. Then he gets to the the expository stuff about Kant, and we already talked about the three persons in one substance. Anyone else remember that? Anyone ever heard of that idea before? Anyone notice that Kant has three persons in one substance? Anyway, the three persons are the substantial person, the person transcendental, the person psychological, and the person moral. And of those, the idea which is most characteristically Kantian in that is the transcendental person, right? And I say most characteristically, this is the person, especially of the first critique of the Critique of Pure Reason, right? It is the person as the subject who is the transcendental unity of apperception. What does that mean? It means that what is putting together all the experiences you have as your experiences, right? All the experiences that are occurring to you have this characteristic, and every one of them is preceded by the little phrase, I think content. I think content. The little I think in front of all of them that are marking them as your thoughts and not somebody else's thoughts and not as objects in the world, but as thoughts. That's what he means by the transcendental subject. And Heidegger brings out the fact that this is a grammatical subject. It's subject in the grammatical sense. It's the subject of the sentence. It's the I in the I think X sentence. And all of the contents of thoughts are off in the object part of the sentence. They come after I think X. And Kant is pointing to this as, Heidegger is pointing to this as Kant agreeing with Descartes. What's the agreement with Descartes? That a thinking thing is something whose determinations are thoughts. And here the determinations, the contents, and the objects all being equated with one another. Object here now not meaning the sofa across the room, but something like the content of my thoughts about the sofa across the room. That's the object standing over against the I think that is thinking them. So there's something thought-like about objects. You have to recognize this, or you're not going to get to Kant at all, right? The thought-likeness about objects is that they are that which stands over against the thinking subject as what it is thinking about. So object of thought, that which you're thinking about, content of thought, determination of the interior of the consciousness at any moment in time, these are the same thing. And what are those things? They're predicates. They are determinations. They are predicates and determinations of what I think, right? So the Cartesian move, the Cartesian doubt move was to, he started from, he doesn't know that he can know anything about the world, but he can know that he's thinking his thoughts, right? He made this move motivated by skepticism, but he claimed that the thing which he can know is the interior of his consciousness. He can know what it is that he thinks. Having made that skeptical move, he is now always saying, I think blah. And everything that he says is in the brackets or the formal construction of an I think blah. And if his I think blahs, as long as he's honest, he's not going to be wrong. This is why Descartes is doing this. It's the characteristic subjectivist modern skeptical move. I'm going to tell you what I think about my thoughts. And as long as I'm being honest about it, right? Okay. So that's just already there in Descartes. But the thing to notice that Kant is taking over from it is this idea that the subject of the sentence is also the subject in the modern sense of the word, the thinking pole of the dyad of the thinking and the thing that is thought. And the object is the thought end of that dyad. It is what is thought about. It is the content of the thought, the content of consciousness. Those are all being equated. Now Heidegger doesn't bring this out totally, but it's definitely there. That dichotomy between the subject doing the thinking and the contentful thoughts about it is very much what we saw in the previous chapter. Those thoughts as predicates are essences. They are determinations. Remember when we saw that determinations were just outlines, that were just shapes, that were just ideas? They were delimitations of things, and the outline or delimitation of something in its essence were the same thing in the previous chapter, right? But now those outlines and determinations are thought-like determinations of the content of consciousness. Their essences in the mind. So that the moderns start from the notion that yes, there's something thought-like about beings, but in the mind. It's the characteristic subjective move, right? So what matters in this? What matters in this is, first of all, the distinction between the thing which exists as an actuality and the content of it as an essence. That distinction has now become the subject-object distinction within the mind. The essences and the objects and the contents of thoughts are over there on the object pole, and the vehicle of all of those properties, Kant calls it the vehicle, a nice little material thing for the chariot that you're riding in, right? The vehicle of all of the determinations of thought, right, is the subject pole. Okay. Now Descartes thinks that you know lots about that subject pole because of this, but Kant doesn't. This is what's characteristically critical about Kant. He claims that of that subject pole itself, the transcendental ego itself, the transcendental unity of apperception, all you know about it is the bare formula, some X that thinks. And that means your knowledge about it is purely formal and practically nil. So all the things you would think about as determinations of it are determinations by it. And all the categories you use to think about it are ways that it has to understand things. And the section that he quotes as the parallelisms of pure reason, right? What Kant is saying there is you can't really use your categories of the understanding to reason about this subject of the understanding, because the subject of the understanding is the precondition for all of them. You can argue about whether or not that's a cogent argument in Kant, but it is the argument he's making. He's trying to say that if you try to reason about the soul with the categories of experience, you're going to fail, because smuggled into all of your experiences are the structures that are thrown over them by the mind, basically. You can go read that section of the Critique of Pure Reason if you want to know what he's thinking about there. He's thinking about the traditional psychology that understands the soul as being a simple thing, as being, because simple, not dissolvable, all these sorts of things that were there in the sort of traditional psychology, which he means the psychology of people like the scholastics. And Kant thinks that all of that is the sort of thing that you cannot reason about, where reason is not sound. Similar to his arguments against the existence of God, he has arguments against those rational deductions about the soul. And all of them have the same basis, that you're trying to apply structures that the mind just throws about the world to try to understand the mind itself. And he claims those categories just don't apply to the mind. The mind as a synthetic unity of apperception is a bare X, something that thinks. It's a bare I think that accompanies all of your thoughts, and that's all you can know about it, according to Kant. So he's trying to explode the possibility of a rational psychology in the sense of a purely deductive rational psychology. Now, he does allow that you can have an empirical psychology. You can know all kinds of things about how human beings actually think if you're willing to bring experience into it. But those are not going to tell you anything about the purely logical nature of the mind. They're not going to tell you anything a priori. They're only going to tell you things which are contingent empirical truths, so to speak. Okay. So that's Kant's self-understanding of his own project. Why is Kant doing this? He's doing this because he wants to delineate where reason is trustworthy. Answer, especially the places where it has a sensuous object about which it can have an empirical intuition and therefore can do science. And where reason is not trustworthy, any place where it doesn't have an experience to latch onto, pretty much, other than the stuff he's actually already done and things like logic. Anyway, that's just, I'm trying to explain Kant's own project from his own point of view, so you don't only get it through the lens of Heidegger, right? But in the course of doing that, he's claiming that of this transcendental person, right, there's remarkably little known about it, other than that it is some X which unifies all of our thoughts across time. Okay. Now, Heidegger is going to try to make much more of that thing than Kant does. First of all, it's across time, right? The fact that we are always already something extended in time as one of the characteristics of Dasein is something that is going to come out big in part 2. The only little piece of that you got in Kant was that he allowed that time was a sort of background intuition for cataloging the experiences of the consciousness as one coming before another, something like that. But that's a very thin notion of time in Kant, as opposed to this very substantive one you're going to get in Heidegger. The point that I'm making is that Kant thinks you can know less about the transcendental person than Heidegger does. Okay, and this is related to Kant generally thinking that things in themselves can't have anything known about them. That you only know the powers of things. You don't know the essences of things. You don't know the ousia of things. And by the way, back when we were doing the whole previous book, we saw that previously in Gregory of Nyssa. This is not an entirely original thought in Kant. There's people much older in the tradition which have this distinction between the being of something as its its essence and its powers, and think you can only know its powers from the relations it enters into. Kant is one of those guys. He thinks you only know the powers of things by how they interact with other things. There's places here where Heidegger is very down on the sort of epistemological understanding of Kant, sometimes with justice, but you have to understand that there are aspects of Kant that sort of fit that, because he's all about knowing how something enters into relationship with something else is the only mode of access to it. And this mode of access, can you know anything about it, aspect of the thinking in Kant is something that's indebted to the skepticism of Hume, but it's also there in people like Gregory, we talked about in the Ancients. Anyway, I just want to point out that it's not as obvious as Heidegger pretends that it is, that all the epistemological readings of Kant are wrong, right? He's accentuating the ways in which Heidegger agrees with Kant, as opposed to the ways in which Heidegger disagrees with Kant, in making that claim. Okay, all that's just on the transcendental person. Questions on the transcendental person before we go to the psychological person?
Yeah, if I can say something, you mentioned the Kant book. I think it's interesting as a continuation of being in time. Heidegger there is trying to explain all Kant's categories in terms of time, I think, and you mentioned that.
Yes.
Time and his categories and the continuation of being in time in terms of Kant.
Yes, and when we're talking about Kantian categories, we're thinking of the sort of the mostly logical categories of number, universality, particularity, but also the modalities of possible, actual, necessary. Those sorts of things are the things which we mean when we say Kantian categories. Heidegger is certainly committed in being in time in this book and in the Kant book to showing how the different structures of Dasein are all understandable in the categories from the categories of time. We'll get that in the second part of this book. There are ways in which, yes, that's also true of the Kantian categories. It's fair to say that although Kant does talk a significant amount about time as one of the necessary forms of intuition, he is not as focused certainly not focused with the same fundamental nature as Heidegger is on time. Even Hegel made more of time than Kant does as a elementary basis of consciousness. Okay. Other questions about the transcendental person, what we mean about the transcendental unity of our perception, all that kind of. Nick.
Well, in that section on the transcendental person, there was a statement that was made, Heidegger made, that a lot of neo-Kantians mistook the critique as just pure epistemology.
Yes.
And he's saying it's ontology. And I somewhat missed the argument there on why it's pure ontology. It had to do with the object being perceived or perceivedness of the object. Is that anyway? A little subtle for me.
Yes.
Too subtle for me.
The point Heidegger is trying to make there is that Kant is not just trying to tell you how you know things. He's also trying to tell you what sort of things exist, what sort of things are, and how are they. And the point about perception there is the perceivedness or of a perceived is something like what Kant means by something accessible by the external sense. And something accessible by the external sense is as close as as Kant gets to something like material things, which to him are appearances. Because they're appearances, they are perceivedness of a perceived. And in the place where a old-fashioned Aristotelian would put material things, Kant puts perceiveds as mere appearances. And Heidegger's point is he's not telling you there's something about how you know things. He's telling you something about what things are. He's telling you that's what the external things are, because he's a transcendental idealist, right? But that's just an example. The more basic thing that Heidegger is doing here is he's trying to assimilate what Kant was doing to his own program, his own and Husserl's program, to understand the being of the different categories of being. In Husserl, you already get elements of this, of, you know, in what way are numbers, in what way are ideas, in what way are material things, right? And trying to understand those things as having being of a different kind because they are different kinds of things, as regional ontologies. You already have this notion of regional ontologies in Husserl, the idea that how a number is and how a Toyota Corolla are not the same, right? And Heidegger is basically saying Kant was already doing something like that. Now, Kant's motives for doing that might have been transcendental idealist motives for doing that, but he was still doing that. He wasn't just telling you how you know things, he was telling you what things are and how they are. Does that help?
Yeah. In some ways, it's also a play of words, because we can only get up to appearances, and what are, for us, are appearances. Is that epistemological or ontological? I guess.
Well,
I can see the ontological.
To a typical modern, logical positivist, say, right? They would separate them sharply, and they would say that there could be things which are to which we have no access, right? Even if it's small things in Andromeda, whatever, right? In other words, even if the reason for it is, historical and trivial, not fundamental as to its nature or something like that, right? But questions about how you know things and questions of what things you regard as having actual existence in the world or in the universe, right, are different philosophical questions. And philosophies don't have to agree on conflating them. There might be some philosophy that conflates them, but they don't have to. A philosophy is free to tell you, here are the things that are, and here's how much you can know about them. Of these, you can't know anything. Of those, you can't know anything. Of these, you can know absolutely everything, whatever. A philosophy as such is free to tell you different things about what things are according to this philosophy or according to this theory, and how much you can know about them. And what he's pointing out is that in his time, a lot of the neo-Kantians had this tendency to read Kant in a purely epistemological manner as only telling them how much they could or couldn't know about things and not what things there were.
Thanks.
Yeah, fine question. Okay, I'm going to assume that the synthetic unity of apperception, despite the elaborateness of the machinery of that statement, is clear. Is that clear? Is everyone clear what Kant means when he says the synthetic unity of apperception? I think if you take that phrase and you put it into something which classifies, the grade level of that phrase, right, it would probably come out as like, 15 or something. But anyway, if I don't get another question on it, I'm just going to breeze right by that. So I'm waiting for you're prompted to either give me a question or I'm going to go on. Okay, the moral person, not the moral person. The moral person we'll get to. In between, he has this really short section on the psychological person. And to me, this is very important, very interesting, especially for what it says about Kant. But the psychological person is kind of the empirical person, but it's also the person as object. It's the mind as object. It's the mind as stream of consciousness. It's the thoughts that happen to you as opposed to the thoughts that you do, right? So regarding consciousness as a passively occurring thing that happens to you and the particular contents of consciousness as being things which you just experience, that you passively undergo, that is what he means by the psychological person. The psychological person is that stream of essences, that stream of predicates happening. And as a happening, it's a passive happening, but it is an aspect of our person that we are the thing that is happening to. Whatever else we are the thing that has those experiences, the things that those things are simply happening to. There is this passive pole of our self, which is still part of our consciousness. It's still part of our existence as a self or as a consciousness, that we undergo our thoughts. And by undergo, the notion here is still that Cartesian one of that a thinking thing is something whose determinations are thoughts, right? The content of the thought and the determination of the consciousness are being equated with one another. we have to ask if this is an adequate understanding of that aspect of mind, because Heidegger is going to bring out a very different one by the beginning of part 2. Heidegger is going to interpret that fact that the Dasein is always absorbing the beings around it, is always getting its content from the beings with which it already is, right, and is co-present with, right, as being something much more fundamental about Dasein. Another way of putting this, I recall there's a philosophy book that was talking about one of the medieval mystics. I think it was talking about Meister Eckhart, and it started a sentence with, according to the Cartesian view, the unassisted human mind, ... right? And I just remember being arrested by that phrase, right? And thinking that, to the person he was talking about, there's no such animal. Human minds are always assisted. They're always plugged into a world around them, which provides them with much of their structure, right? There are no disembodied minds. Joe?
That goes straight to a point that Craig made very early on, that as an infant, you're taught by talking or listening to your parents about the structure that you're making sense of as you learn to navigate through it. And so I think that reinforces that perspective. You learn from everybody else because what you know comes because of what people told you, and then later as you become more adult,
Sure.
you investigate and tell them.
There are elements of that which are matters of being with and having a culture and that sort of thing, learning a language from others, etc. There's also, though, just the question of how much the mind is already structured to understand the sorts of things that happen in the world, right? To claim that there's none would be a heroic statement.
Yeah.
And for everything we know about both developmental psychology, evolution, and artificial intelligence, an unlikely one, right? That is, it's a very blank slate hypothesis, which is, for which there's remarkably little evidence. Let's put it that way.
Well, if the young child doesn't learn the way of the world that actually works, then it's not real. And
I want to bring us back to the philosophical position for a second. So in Fichte, who's right after Kant, right, and is trying to make much of this, the claim is that the ego first understands the category of being as that which resists the ego, right? Not ego means resists ego. In other words, what you cannot change just by thinking differently is you categorize as not me and as real because resistant to imagination. And to Fichte, that's the original experience from which something like a notion of an external being arises. So you do get people in this tradition who try to do some of these sort of developmental psychology sort of questions or moves, but it's not Heidegger doing them. Okay, but there's another point here that I want to make. Whereas the synthetic unity of apperceptions or transcendental person was this very, it was this logic-like thing. It was the thing which gave us access to to a set of truths, something like that. It was a unity of all the truths that we experience. This psychological person is instead a unity of felt experiences and empirical experiences. Okay, so it's not judgments. It's not a logical thing. It's a passionate thing. It is a pathos thing. It is something which experiences, undergoes, etc. And what is noteworthy is that Kant has an attitude towards it, which is, it will come out in the moral section, but which is sharply distinguished from his attitude towards the transcendental person or the moral person. The transcendental person is what makes us a rational being. And the moral person is what makes us an end in ourselves and a spirit, right? A person in the full sense of person. But our psychological person, to Kant, is a mere thing. And Heidegger emphasizes that he says this. He calls it a thing, right? So it is understood with the category of the extent. It is understood as the basis of the animal, right? The alive as the animal, as a thing, as the passive. And there's no getting around the fact that for Kant, this is a judgment of morality and dignity, not simply a description of things, right? When he gets onto the part about respect and the moral person, the thing which will highlight the fact that the moral person is so much more than a thing is the fact that he can resist all of his inclinations out of respect for the moral law. If a man could not resist his inclinations out of respect for the moral law, he would just be a machine. And whatever buttons were pushed on him to get him to feel this or that, he would just react to those feelings and he would just be a machine to Kant. And as such, to Kant, he would lack moral dignity. So Kant has remarkably little respect for the animal man, if I can put it that way. He has some respect for the intellectual man, for the man as mind as truth machine, right? But he has even more for the morally responsible acting man. But the heightened respect that he has for the moral acting man is precisely because he can resist his inclination. He could be more than animal. So and remember that all this is supposed to be an a priori understanding of the nature of humanity. It's meant to be from before all experience. And it's not obvious this is before all experience. When Heidegger gets to talking about the way in which man passively just soaks up the being of the things around him, or spends most of its life in the inauthentic way of getting its content just from the beings that it is interacting with, which we'll get to later, he doesn't have anything like this denigration of that fact, right? It's still a way in which being appears to man. Anyway, it's striking to me that there's this almost stoic-like moralizing heroism of if you were just a passionate machine, there would be nothing respectable about you in Kant. Anyway, I don't know if anyone else.
Yeah, the word that Kant uses so much is pathological. That's
Yes.
right, yeah.
Yes. The pathological man, the man of pathos, the man of just his feelings, is a thing and is not worthy of respect to Kant. And to me, that's freighted, right? Because you have to ask. Kant has the categorical imperative, which is, act as though you could treat every human being, as an end in themselves, not just as a means, right? And there is this sharp distinction. He doesn't want human beings to be means, but the reasons that they're not means, the reason that they're ends in themselves is because they are capable of moral responsibility, right? But it is their moral responsibility that gives them dignity, not their pathological passionateness, so to speak. Okay, so let's move on to the third, which is the moral person. And there's elements of this which Heidegger shows great respect for. Heidegger is often accused of not having a morality or having only a morality of authenticity. But here he's mostly agreeing with much of what Kant says about respect and the moral law. The law, by the way, that is being talked about here is always the moral law as the law that the rational mind gives to itself. They're not talking about the law that a legislator laid down, right? This is always law as autonomously self-given rational morality. One of the other things that's noteworthy here is that what makes there's two things that make two or three things that make the moral law respectable. One is the way in which it is the humanity rising above animality, or rising above being a mere thing. The other is the generality of the act, right? The thing which commands respect in the moral law is its generality. And you have to ask why that is, right? Why does something have to be generalizable to be worthy of respect? Answer, because otherwise it will be suspected of being self-seeking and self-aggrandizing. It would be the special pleading of the animal man. And the special pleading of the animal man is not worthy of respect to Kant. It's important to notice that. Okay. We talked a little about the respect being a feeling, and this was, the point there is that there has to be something, not there has to be, it is important for Kant that there is something in the phenomena of respect for the moral law that is a before experience possible feeling. Because you could easily have the notion that all feelings are only results of experience, right? There's something passive about feeling itself, so that you could think that you have to passively undergo to feel. But supposedly, respect for the moral law is a feeling that could be elicited by a form of reason itself. And I don't think there's any question that Kant thinks that the categorical imperative is respectable enough that if you hear it, you respect it, something like that, without having, just as a rational person, without having, without needing any sort of prior cultural conditioning to do so, or prior experience to do so. This is a debatable proposition, right? Certainly has been debated by people like Nietzsche. And there are others who would see in it an attempt to capture something like what's true about the golden rule without any of the baggage, something like that, while being perfectly rational. And you can ask whether that's an improvement or not, or the opposite of the original. But it's noteworthy that here Heidegger is, he both agrees with the much of the moral teaching of Kant, and he also praises Kant for his phenomenological perceptiveness in understanding the phenomena of respect. The other place where I see a real continuity between Heidegger and Kant here is, for Kant, respect for the moral law shows the human being as acting, as not just as active in the sense of spontaneous, but as acting. And man as acting man is definitely what you're getting from being in time and much of the rest of this. The eventual understanding of Dasein will be that something like understands the beings in terms of its own possibilities for action. And that's what the phenomena of care is about. So you don't find anything here like care, but there is the point in common of man as capable not just of passion or understanding, but of action, as being fundamental to the mindfulness of man. By the way, he translates mind a whole bunch of places here. The original word in German, because it's mind, is also spirit, right? And you have to go through there and say, read all those things where he's saying, Kant is saying man is a mind. Kant is saying man is a spirit. And that's an overtone that will also be brought out by Hegel's version of all that.
So the word is Geist, in other words.
Exactly, which means mind or spirit indifferently. Okay. Any questions about the Kantian moral pole? Nick.
I'm just wondering how much this idea of feeling is really something one can see in Kant versus something that Heidegger expands on and in some ways exaggerates maybe. But this is his interpretation, because my first reading of Kant, which is, I would have to say, thorough, I do not recall the word feeling coming up much, or emphasize. Therefore,
Comes up a lot in the critique of judgment, that's for sure.
which
Sure.
is what I'm talking about. Well, I guess maybe I just don't remember. It didn't stand out. to me.
So there are plenty of places where Kant talks about feeling, especially in the context of aesthetic feeling and so forth, as we're talking about the critique of judgment. But here we're talking specifically about
Respect.
the feeling of respect, right? And there's two things going on there. Let's first just make sure we understand a little piece of Kant. So Kant is saying that there is something going on in the feeling of respect, which allows reason to act. And the point there is there's something about the structure of the feelings themselves, the animal man, which is effectively passive, machine-like, reactive, responding to incentives, we would say, right? It consists of pushable buttons, and if the buttons are pushed, it acts in the way that it is incentivized to act by the buttons that have been pushed. And in that sense, passive. The path. So there's that aspect of the pathos man. In order for any of those feelings, which are normally determining the behavior, to be overridden by a purely rational interest, the rational interest needs a feeling too. You can't fight a feeling with a thought. You can only fight a feeling with another feeling. And what he sees in the phenomenon of respect is a way in which a purely rational motive can give rise to a feeling, which as a feeling can trump other feelings and can therefore effectively prevent the purely passive animal from deciding what you do.
Yeah.
This goes back, by the way.
get that.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, go. No, I see that, and he expounds it very well. Heidegger does. It's just that I don't remember getting that message directly from the critique of judgment itself.
It's not in the critique of judgment. It's in the
feeling.
I think that this particular part is actually in the grounding the
metaphysics of morals.
Grounding the metaphysical of morals. That's right.
Oh yeah, that
But-
I haven't
but-
read. Yes, okay.
But I think it's also fair to say that Heidegger is emphasizing it more here for different reasons than Kant. For Kant, he's trying to show how his view of how reason acts can fit into a mostly mechanical model of man, something like that. Because understand, Kant is reacting to an environment in which he's surrounded by Lockean empiricists and Humean skeptics and Hobbesian, man as a machine types and so forth, as well as Leibnizians and so on, right? And he wants to explain how Kant is saying something like morality can get a human being to act, and a passive construction animal understanding of man is going to say that's silly. Reason can give you a maxim, it can give you a conclusion, you can deduce something as true or false by it, but it can't motivate you to act. Only motives can do that, and motives are emotions, and emotions are animal, right? And so it is that particular possible objection of, say, a Hobbes or Hume that Kant is anticipating here in this argument. The other thing I'd point out, though, is that there's a long tradition of this sort of analysis of the human being and regarding there as being something respectable and spiritual, which is above the passionate animal man. If you think back quite a ways, we saw this way back in the Gnostics. We were reading about them. The distinction between the perfect and the soulful man. The soulful man, the psychic man, was the man who was all soul and wasn't any spirit. And that was proved by the fact that he was, a slave to the things of this world because they were what motivated him, whereas the spiritual man was above it. There's echoes here of the spiritual.
Book, right?
Yes.
Was that another book?
Another book like 3 times ago.
Okay.
But the point is there's echoes here in Kant of that spiritual man doctrine as something which can override the passions. Right.
No, I find this part to be very insightful. It kind of moved me. The idea of replacing what is instinctual or desire, that feeling that we have with desire, with something else that is has to be the moral law, just in respect. And that in itself also has to be a feeling to overcome. Because before that, I would always think of Kantian moral categorical imperative is very cold, very rational, very cold. But this one puts in emotions right into it. There's So, wow.
Although only a little bit. All right, Carlos?
You, excuse me, you mentioned the word care.
Yes.
And we know that Heidegger uses that word. I don't want to digress, but was that intimately related to the discussion you're having right now? As emotions and morality?
So Heidegger doesn't talk about care here, and certainly Kant doesn't talk about care. For Heidegger, in Being and Time, care is, a fundamental structure of Dasein in the sense of involvement with being and its own capacity to be, something like that. Okay. And this is also why, to get up to your question, Dasein is always affectable by mood, right? The fact that Dasein has moods is related to care. Mm. A way of putting this in sort of modern terms would be the consciousness is never a disembodied, not even disembodied. It's never an unmotivated artificial intelligence simply processing experiences, right? It is embodied, passionate, involved in its life, and that's why it is all of its experiences have moods, are colorable by emotion, etc. And this is not, to Heidegger, unlike for Kant, something which lacks dignity in man. This is not something which is animal in man that we should cry over and try to surpass. This is instead part and parcel of the, if I put it this way, the pathos of human existence or something like that.
Yeah, but does the word care, and I don't mean to digress, we can take this up offline or whatever, because you have another line of progress here, but would you say that for Heidegger, care has more meaning or more ample meaning than the word conveys in English?
It is a different one. Care in English conveys something of a sense of for others and compassion that is not Correct. There in the German.
Right.
In the German, it's much more like involved.
I'm interested in, or it has an impact on me.
Interest is not really quite the right word, but certainly involved in, certainly invested in. Is again too cold. Cares are what people have that makes life tragic. The geographical definition of the place where we are is a vale of tears because it is full of care. Cares are what you have 1,000 of and not enough time to deal with. Cares are burdens. Cares are crosses borne. And that's why I say that there's something about the notion of care in Heidegger, which is very far from being looked down upon as passion, right? There's a looking down on of passion from the lofty heights of rational moralism that's a kind of stoic proud man pose in Kant, and there's none of that in Heidegger. Heidegger is way more Kierkegaardian Christian in that respect.
Well, would the word attachment work better?
It's too desiccated, late, and yeah. I mean, yeah.
I think I have a word.
If you don't hear the accents of Vale of Tears in it, you're not getting the notion. Sorry, someone had another comment.
I was going to say, but I am. What you just said about the Vale of Tears derails my original. There's a word in Spanish that I attributed to care that fits in my mind a little better, but it doesn't bring to mind a Vale of Tears. It's more like I'm interested in, not interested. That's not it either. It has an impact on me, type of meaning.
Concern, sometimes the word concern.
Concern is, yeah, but concern not in the sense of I'm worried. Concern more like it's something that I'm interested. I don't want to say.
What is the Spanish word for those of us who know some Spanish?
Importar.
All right, I'm gonna interrupt with a little passage from Being in Time where he's giving a little fable. Once when Care was crossing a river, she saw some clay. She thoughtfully took up a piece and began to shape it. While she was meditating on what she had made, Jupiter came by. Care asked him to give it spirit, and this he gladly granted. But when she wanted her name to be bestowed upon it, he forbade this and demanded that it be given his name instead. While Care and Jupiter were disputing, Earth arose and desired that her own name be conferred upon the creature, once she had furnished it with part of her body. Then they asked Saturn to be their arbiter, and he made the following decisions, which seemed to be a just one. Since you, Jupiter, have given it spirit, you shall receive that spirit at its death. And since you, Earth, have given its body, you shall receive its body. But since Care first shaped this creature, she shall possess it as long as it lives. And because there is now a dispute among you about its name, let it be called Homo, as made out of the humus of the earth. So Care will possess you as long as you live, in the sense of trouble. It's the meaning of the story.
Well, it occurs to me that importar, the verb that Carlos mentioned, is basically, I mean, if you break it down, I mean, port is a door, right? It's like portal, right? So it's, and im is into. So basically I bring it into me. So I mean, attachment sounds kind of like remote, but basically it's the idea of bringing, and it perfectly fits with the idea of worlds, right? Basically, that you bring them, you are attached, you brought something into you, or something has introduced itself into you.
Right, but that's not yet the notion of care. That's too close to just the notion of a being experienced.
Yeah, I have to agree that there must be, I mean, I don't speak German, but obviously, what is the word in German? Sorge or something like that?
Yes.
I don't have the
Sorge.
George, I don't have the intuition that you have into that word. I was from reading what I've read of Heidegger. Every time I found that word and its attempted description or use, I knew it wasn't care in the sense of caring for the sick. I knew it was something more ample, and I kept juxtaposing this importar in Spanish, and it made a little more sense of what I was reading. But apparently it's even more ample or has other connotations.
Fair, but I mean, it would include the caring for the sick if you cared for the sick in the right way. If you're only caring for the sick performatively as something you should do, it wouldn't. Our notion of what we see as morally praiseworthy in someone caring for someone else is not the accent he's looking at, but it might be the burning concern of someone who has a calling to care for the sick.
Concern is more like it.
Yeah, it has to be a concern which is not simply rational. It has to be a passionate concern. But anyway, just getting into what he means by the word, and it's really in being in time more than here. But I did want to bring out this fact that Kant is very down on the passive man in a way that Heidegger is not. Okay, we talked about the moral man. Okay.
Can I just extend the thing about care a little longer? Because when I read Heidegger's care, sometimes I have a negative interpretation of it. And I want to be corrected if I'm wrong, because I look at care as sometimes meaning care too much or concern too much. And that is one of the things that leads the Das Man into a situation of inauthenticity, when he cares about what others think, when he cares about too much of what the world thinks or is. I lump that in with the word care. Is that incorrect of me?
Yeah, there's not that note is not there in care. It's not there in the concerns with inauthenticity or the they or Das Man or any of those sorts of notions which are also there in being in time. None of those might be forms of care, although they're usually less authentic forms of care. They're mostly ways of running away from care from Heidegger's point of view. Certainly, if you're distracting yourself with the everyday in order to not attend to what needs attending to, you were doing the opposite of eliciting care.
Okay.
Right.
Okay.
But I don't know if that helps. But okay, let's get back to our text and ask what's wrong with this explication of the nature of the human being that we got from Kant, according to Heidegger in the chapter. He's got multiple criticisms of this threefold understanding of the human person. And before we get into the stuff at the very end where he brings out all this stuff about world, which we'll get to, he has basic criticisms of Kant's understanding of the person in terms of these three moments. People remember what he said? What does he have against this notion? I see we lost Jim. No thoughts. Well, the first is there's too many of them. He was supposed to tell us in what the being of the unified intellect or consciousness or thing that thinks consists. And he didn't tell us one thing, he told us three things. He told us something which unifies all the thoughts or experiences, but is an X about which you can't know anything, and something which passively undergoes, and something that acts. But he didn't tell you how all those things fit together. He didn't tell you how all those things are one thing. And he didn't tell you how that one thing is either. He's characterized different moments, which might be phenomenally true of the nature of consciousness, right? But he didn't tell you how consciousness isn't a thing. In fact, he told you that the moral man was a thing, not the moral man, sorry, the psychological man was a thing, right? And the only thing which he, and then of the transcendental, he told you that it's a bare X about which you can know nothing. And then the only one that he had this heightened respect for was the moral moment in man. And there, what did he tell you about it? That man must be thought of as an end, that respectable because an end. Okay, but we also learned that the basis of that respect was something like not being animal, right? It was the contrast between the moral man and the psychological man that was at the core of the basis of the respect for the moral man. It was his ability to leave the kingdom of animal causality that led Kant to respect him and to treat him as an end. Okay, what if someone just isn't capable of heroic moral action like that, at least at the moment? What if they're just not heroically morally acting? What if they are not rising above their inclinations by obeying a moral law and acting according to a categorical imperative? Are they ends? Are they worthy of respect? On Kant's own terms, it's only the capability of perhaps acting that way that is worthy of respect. Now, maybe you have to have enough agnosticism about how they're actually acting to, give them the charity of thinking they'll start doing it tomorrow, even if they don't seem to be doing it now. But Kant doesn't actually say that. He does say you always have to treat them as an end, but even if they are not acting according to the categorical imperative. So the categorical imperative is something which everyone has to do. They're morally obligated to do it. Okay, so what happens if they don't? The answer is just, then they're not worthy of respect.
You still have to treat them as an end, right?
You still have to treat them as an end, even though they're not worthy of respect. There's a paradox of tolerance problem in Kant, is what I'm trying to tell you, right? Because the thing which is respectable about man is his capacity for moral heroism. It is his capacity for moral heroism which is respectable in him. Therefore, all the moral heroes among men are respectable, but all the the immoral non-heroes among men are not. But they still have to be treated as ends. So the reason that this is a problem is this is a purely rational category. It's even an a priori category. And it's supposed to be the reason why we treat people as ends and not in a way that we would never treat tables. But the basis of the respect seems to be contingent upon how they have acted upon it. So they're responsible, but how do we treat them for how they've used the responsibility? Maybe to not respect someone because they are not obeying the categorical imperative is a form of respect of them because it's a respect for the moral law. I think that's the actual only Kantian way out, right? It's to regard someone, you're treating someone with respect if you're holding them to the standard of the categorical imperative because you're treating them as a rational being, even if they're not acting that way. So I think that that's the only actual Kantian way out of that. So I think it's where he would come out, but you do have to notice the problem. So Carlos?
So if I heard you correctly, Kant doesn't address the fact that, doesn't address the contingency that somebody doesn't obey the categorical imperative, just merely that it's a potentiality within that individual that makes it an end, makes it a person an end.
Yes.
Yeah,
They are a moral actor and a rational being because they can be held to the standard of the moral law because they could obey the moral law.
Even if they're murderers.
Exactly. And the objection is, but could I because of my passions? And the answer is you can because you must. Right? So holding the murderer to the standard that he should have acted in a more universal way than he acted is precisely respecting him as a moral agent.
Defining him at least.
Yes. So anyway, that I think that's the only I think that's the way Kantian morality actually handles the thing. But the thing to notice is what does it mean then to treat someone as an end? It means to judge them according to the to the categorical imperative. That's what it means. So the categorical imperative says treat everybody as an end, and what does that amount to? It amounts to treating them as a responsible moral actor and holding them to the standard that they should so act. Right? You should treat everyone as a possible moral hero. That's the actual subject of it. So, but this was not meant to be a prescription for legislation or telling us something about how to act. It may have also been that as morals, but it was also supposed to tell us what humanity is, what human beings are. And the answer seems to be something like at least potential moral heroes, right? But then the question you have to ask is the potential actual question with respect to them. Okay, why am I bringing all this up? I'm bringing all this up because one of the things we learned from the previous chapter was that if you treat people as having essences and existences, you're treating them as things. And that was exactly what we were supposedly going to learn to not do in this chapter. And we have learned it this much, right? That there are things which are potential moral heroes that have to be treated as ends because they are potential moral heroes. But their potential actual distinction is just like the potential actual distinction of things. Their animal nature is itself a thing, and the content of their thoughts is an essence in the same old essence and actuality distinction we had before. So the real reason that we're treating them differently is for a potential that they have, where the potential is understood in the same way as the previous. Okay, so the Heideggerian criticism here is, has he really told us how this thing is just because he told us that it is an end? He claims he hasn't. He also claims that by giving us these three parts, he hasn't given us a self-understanding of what it means to be this sort of self. And Kant's reason for that is, well, of course we can't understand ourselves. We didn't make ourselves. That's his second substantive criticism. And why is that a substantive criticism for him? Because you could see that as echoing in some ways some of Heidegger's own language about thrownness. Heidegger certainly agrees that we do not simply make ourselves. We always find ourselves with some past that we didn't simply cause, right? Thrown into the world, right? So in that sense, there is a kind of agreement in the didn't make ourselves. But he criticizes Kant here for that notion because he sees it as being exactly the same notion of being that we saw in the understanding beings from the comportment of production in the previous chapter. It's God who makes beings, and therefore only God who understands the beings. And man, not being God, never actually understands the beings. He only receives appearances, something like that. And in that sense, we are not creators. That's the Kantian position on it. But the not creators aspect of that, Heidegger is seeing as a holdover from a notion of what being is that Heidegger diagnoses as going back to Plato and the Greeks, to being as ousia, as raw potential that is shaped and formed in acts of production. Why does this matter? Can you shape an end in an act of production? The things you shape in acts of production are means to the thing that you're shaping them for. And the danger with respect to men, if you are going to treat them with the notion of being you got from ousia, from raw material, from potential, is that you will not treat them as ends if you treat them as means. So Kant does not want us to treat men as means, but he still has this notion of to fully understand something, you have to be the producer of it, that is itself indebted to the productive comportment understanding of being. So that's the second criticism that Heidegger has of the Kantian understanding.
To the production idea, though, I mean, while you're in the process of producing something, then yes, it's well, I don't know if means is quite the right word there, but definitely it's not, it's an end in itself until the production itself is ended, and now the thing assumes the status
Full being,
of it,
yes, you let it go and it assumes full being, sure. But if we take this attitude towards human beings, maybe we get a notion of paideia or education that eventually lets them mature into the full adult human beings of Craig's thought. But before then, there's something running around in the background here that I want people to hear the notes of throughout this, which is there's a notion that runs through this Heideggerian thought about what he doesn't like about he's calling here the traditional ousia concept of being, which is something like you always build with stones, and if you're going to, even if you build with men, you'll build with them by regarding them as stones. Anyway, this is why this notion of is it adequate to say of human beings that they are ends, although ends that did not make themselves? That's what Kant gave us as what is dignified in man. That's all he gave us as what is dignified in man. And to Heidegger, it's not adequate. It's not adequate to the phenomena of what makes consciousness different from tables. And it's also not adequate as to what is actually respectable in man.
The Frankenstein myth comes to mind, and it's actually making your point, not mine, and it makes sense. So the Frankenstein did come to life, but because they knew that he was constructed, and that they were continually reminded of the fact that he was so ugly, that they couldn't regard him as a person, even though certainly, you know, in her work, don't think of the movies necessarily.
Sure.
He's really like a person.
Sure. And that's coming around the same time of this early German idealism stuff. It's coming out of the same school as people who are reading Fichte and Schelling, right? But it's a fine comment to recognize that sort of cultural note in that period. Okay, I think we might get there later, but in mature Heidegger, what is respectable about man is that he is the shepherd of being, the place or site where being happens. And that's not the same thing as being an end at all. Carlos, question?
I think
is this, I'm hearing you say something that elicits the concept of what made that being, where does it come from? Is that what you're driving at? In other words, an uncovering of a...
It is something like an uncovering of, but not a creator of. Right? To Heidegger, Dasein as or man as shepherd of being, or Dasein as place or site where being happens, has a dignity that does not depend upon a categorical imperative and is never material.
It's prior to all of that.
Yes. It is
more primal.
Primal has too many historical connotations. It is the pop cultural phrase would be the world on you depends. Is their world? We'll move on to being in the world, but the point is that the notion of something like humanity or human dignity in Heidegger is not as narrow moralistic as it is in Kant. Nick?
Yeah, there's a passage, I think, on page 138 that sheds a little light on why man is an end in itself. It starts kind of like the paragraph, the full paragraph, only thus is the basis gained. But to give context to this, I read the last sentence of the previous paragraph. The moral person exists as its own end. It is itself an end. Only thus is the basis gained for distinguishing ontologically between beings that are egos and beings that are not egos, between subject and object, res cogitans and res extensa. The beings whose existence rests indeed not on our will, but on nature in the sense of physical organization, have nevertheless, if they are beings lacking reason, only a relative value as means, and are therefore called things. In contrast, rational beings are called persons because their nature here is synonymous with thesis as equivalent to essentia, singles them out already as ends in themselves, as something which may not be used merely as means, and hence to this degree limits all arbitrary choice and is an object of respect. What constitutes the nature of the person, its essentia, and limits all choice, which means that it is determined as freedom, is an object of respect. So that's the essential thing seems to be the will or the free will that is
Yes,
essential.
he's explaining Kant there. He's saying that this is what
Yes, this is Kant. This is Kant.
This is
Kant.
Heidegger explaining what he sees as being what is the humanity of man or the dignity of man, right?
Mhm.
And it depends upon not being a thing, therefore not having merely relative value as means, and that stems from a nature, which is a power that the human being has that mere things do not have, to be able to act according to a moral law.
To have choice in the first place, to have will, a free will.
Free will, yes, but choice is not the point. To Kant, freedom is not freedom to act differently as you list, because that is often just following the animal interests. Freedom to Kant is the freedom to act morally. It's the ability to act not because you are caused to act by your passions, but to act because morality commands that you act thus.
Right.
So
I mean,
from Kant's point of view, this is not emphasizing the choice aspect at all. It's emphasizing the obedience aspect.
well, there's a way of interpreting where freedom, if acting like an animal is not acting freely.
Exactly.
You're just a slave to your desires.
This is a very traditional notion. This is
the
the notion of freedom that you get in the Stoa, right? And it's not a notion of freedom which is I can do what I choose.
Right.
Right. It's a notion of freedom of I can do what is right, even if my passions are against it. It's being able to rise above passion. Right. So it's a very Stoic notion of moral dignity. Right. But the point that I'm making is all of that in Kant is dependent upon this superiority over animality, and seeing dignity as only accruing from that. That is not what you get in Heidegger at all. In Heidegger, there is a dignity of man as the place of sight where being happens, independent of any such moral question. In older language, more traditional language, I would say Heidegger sees the fact that man is spirit as not coming from his morality. It's coming more from his mindliness. Okay. But I'm just trying to bring out the differences in accents between full Heidegger and Kant here.
He doesn't really get into that, does he, Heidegger? I mean, that's why people say he doesn't really have a moral statements. He doesn't have. He only
by the mature Heidegger, he certainly by the mature Heidegger he certainly does. And here on the simple question of moral law, he's more or less agreeing with Kant, and he's praising this aspect of Kant as the place where he's finally told us what's different about the the things which are mere things and the things which think. So at least he's made an ontological distinction between them. But is it the ontological distinction that that Heidegger's going to make between them? No, it's not. The ontological distinction that Heidegger's going to make between them is Daseins are entities that have worlds, and intraworldly beings don't have worlds. That's not the same distinction as we just heard about moral dignity. It's way more basic, right? And it's meant to be something which is way more phenomenal. It's something you verify by direct inspection, or you notice by direct inspection. It's meant to be way more evident, and it's also much less lofty in the sense of difficulty of attainment. It may be, not trivial to notice it, but when it is pointed out to you, it is something which every human being is capable of understanding without necessarily being a moral hero. Anyway, I'm just, again, this is too much focusing on the differences between Heidegger and Kant. I want to get to the second half of the chapter, right? Where we finally get to being in the world. So this is the place where he starts bringing out his own way in which he thinks the being that we ourselves are is different from the being of material objects, interworldly things. And he wants to anchor that in more immediate experience, more immediate phenomenal evidence. But he's also going to make much more of it. We're going to make much more of it. He first just wants you to notice the phenomena of being in the world. And this is something where I think he does a more exhaustive job of it in being in time than he does here. He's kind of trying to do it fast here, and he's expecting you to see it right away. But I first just want to see whether or not people here get this notion of being in the world. I think some of the people who studied being in time with us before, probably get it, but it's not a trivial notion. What does being in the world mean? Pete, you want to take a stab at it?
This is without the hyphens.
No, you can have hyphens. Pete. You're on mute, Pete.
I've unmuted myself. So what I would say that being in the world, I'm gonna return to the notion we talked about 15 minutes ago about care and what's important, lo que importa, what matters. And being in the world, you're in the world of the things that matter to you. And directly in this text, on page 159, about 12 lines from the bottom, there's a short sentence that says, each one of us is what he pursues and cares for. And so here I'm arguing for a sort of weaker sense of care. And I think there's other Heideggerians, and somebody mentioned Tom Sheehan's Paradigm book. And this is one of the arguments he makes, that one sense of being Heidegger uses is the German Sinn, S-I-N-N, of something, the meaning of something. So the being of something is what's important, what matters, what sense somebody has. So being in the world is Dasein, and the things that Dasein cares about, that matter to Dasein.
So I partly agree, but I think we got to get way more simple first, right? you're right that some of the beings that Dasein is with, because Dasein is in the world, are the beings that Dasein cares about, right? But first, there's just the fact that Dasein is always already in a world, right? What it means to be a consciousness, what it means to be an intelligence, what it means to be a subject, what it means to be a res cogitans, is first of all that you always already are in a world. You are
That you're
always
thrown in the world. Yeah, I agree.
you're also thrown into it, but keep the accent off the throne, because that's the thing about how you got there and about how you didn't make yourself. But leave that accent first. Just notice the fact. The reason he uses the word Dasein, their being, is there's always a there in front of you, right? You're always already at a there. You're always already in a place. You're always already situated, right? You are surrounded, invaded by an environing world. You are not an inside. You're always already outside in the world. You're always already among beings. You're always already with others, with other people, right? All of those are different structural moments of being in the world. The fundamental thing, though, is tables aren't surrounded by projected consciousnesses. There aren't a bunch of different beings presented in the different sides of the table, right? That is experiencing. Consciousnesses are. Consciousnesses are different from things. Consciousnesses have whole worlds attached to them, worlds that they have projected, with the categories of their concern, yes. But first, there's just worlds that they have projected. To be a consciousness is always already to have projected a world, right? So fundamental idealist subjectivist aspect of worlds are more than that, but they are first also just that you're always already in a projected space. Isn't even the right word. You are in a projected reality. You are in a projected existence. You have an existence, right? And that world is there before its contents. That world is there when you're asleep. You're never not in the world. You didn't get dropped into the world from Mount Olympus either, right? Leaving aside all the developmental psychology questions about how old you were when you first noticed it, right? As conscious, you're in a world. Okay, that's the first thing about first thing to notice about being in the world. And it's not just that you have a world, right? You're in it. You're not looking at the world from the outside. You're not watching the world on a movie screen. You're inside the damn movie, right? You are in the world. You can turn around, and your experiences may move. You don't. The world is still there, right? And this is being. This is not something that you're thinking. This is not something that you are imagining. It's a reality. It's a brass tacks reality. It's the first ontological fact, right? You are in a world. And he's trying to be that phenomenal. He's trying to be that basic. Go look at the damn evidence. You're in a world, right? And he wants to hit you over the head with how obvious that fact is and about how easy it is to ignore it and to ignore how distinctive it is of things which are in the manner of consciousnesses. Tables don't do this. Okay, so he wants to differentiate between the kinds of beings that we ourselves are and tables first that way, right? Next thing about it, there's all kinds of other moments of that. This consciousness, this world, this experience, this sphere of experience, whatever you want to call it, is yours. Yes, there are aspects of the world that you share with other Daseins. You are with other Daseins, and there are interworldly objects around you both that are part of a common world. There's even a common time in that common world, which we'll get to later, right? But it's your experience of the world is still your experience of the world. You don't think Steven Spielberg's experience of the world, right? You're not watching a movie somebody else is directing, right? You're in the world and it's your world. And it's your world because it happens to you, but it's also your world because the concerns that populate it are your concerns, and because you matter to yourself in it. Your being itself is at stake in that world. You are not passively watching your life, you're living your life, and you're in the middle of it. All of these are sort of the existential base things that he's starting from here. Why? Because this is supposed to be a chapter that tells us how things which think are different from things which are extended. And what he's trying to, make obvious to you is these brass tacks facts that he's laying out weren't what Descartes was talking about, and they weren't what Kant was talking about, and they weren't what Plato was talking about. Why? It's obvious, so why isn't it on their lips everywhere? Why isn't it the first thing they start from? It's weird that they don't start from things this basic. Okay. But he also wants you to just get used to the idea that there is phenomenal evidence of these things. You don't have to ask what Thomas Aquinas thought about it. You don't have to ask what Aristotle thought about it. You can just look. You can directly inspect the phenomenal evidence and see. Okay. So there's that aspect of the phenomenal evidence as he moves into explaining world to you. Right after he explains that you are in a world, he goes off on this stuff of what are the things there are that appear to you, and he brings up this equipmental contexture business. And that's partly what Peter's talking about. If the things that populate your world are the things that you're concerned with, they're also the things that you can interact with, which is weird, right? Joe mentioned earlier that chairs are things that you can sit on, right? This functional in order to is the fundamental basic organizing category of the bits of your experience that you turn into things. You don't experience a blank wall of pixels. You experience things, but you experience those things always as picked out of a whole equipmental contexture. All of them freighted with what you can do with them. And this is part of this embedded in care. It's something like how you actually can interact with the world is part of what makes something mean enough to you that it is organized as a being that you experience. Joe?
Yeah, it seems to me that this phenomenological thing that we're talking about here can also just be identified as empirical reality that can also be reduced to measurement, because that's what we're doing. Phenomenology here is how it comes to us, and then we begin to apply sort of metric things. We get into things that the empirical scientists think are the holy grail.
The only reason we measure things is because we're afraid we might disagree with one another about them otherwise. If we want to be precise about how we agree about an interworldly thing, we go measure it. And what that means is we both look at the same measurement, we both perform the same measurement and expect to get the same result. We don't expect your ruler stick and my ruler stick to be to expand and contract between our measurements, right? But it's only when we're trying to get at agreement that way that we bother to measure things. Why? Why do we have to do that at all? Because your world is not my world before we do that. We can ascertain things about the interworldly that we agree upon with methods like measurement, which we only have to resort to in the first place, because I don't just look through your eyes and see what you see. And you don't just look through my eyes and see what I see. And because we don't do that, we have to resort to these absurdly complicated, weird things with rulers in order to figure out that we're talking about the same thing, right? Just pointing at it often suffices, but if it doesn't, we'll bring out the meter stick, right? To see if we're talking about the same thing. But the reason we can have that confusion in the first place is because I'm in a different world than you are to begin with. Okay. Pete, reactions to my pontification?
Oh, I would just say that even it's not just between me and somebody else that we have to measure things. Even myself, I'm not in the same world today as I was yesterday.
Sure.
So that's why I took my temperature yesterday, so I know where I am today. So measurement is just any difference.
I get you, but I mean, to Heidegger, you're in the same world you were in yesterday. Your world is a changing thing. It's a changing place. Real change happens in the world. But to be clear about what he means by world, worlds are temporally extended things, just like you are. They're not instants. World at an instant is not part of the concept world. It may be part of the concept state or state of a world, but the world itself is a temporally extended thing. By the way, so are you. Right? We'll get to that in first part of part 2. Sorry, go ahead, Carlos.
Is it too far to go to extend the concept of measurement to meaning? When you measure something and derive some meaning from this, and that's what you're trying to establish some commonality with somebody else.
So meaning is a trickier one, but I mean the perfect example of why we care about things like meaning is the phenomena of attention, right? There's the famous psychological experiment where you're asked the person to count how many times the ball is passed, and while they're doing that, nobody notices that someone walked in the middle of the stage, in the middle of the bear suit, right? Because they weren't looking for it, right? Because they didn't care, because they weren't paying attention.
Mm-hmm.
And because they didn't care and they weren't paying attention, they didn't see it at all, right? So there's something about the phenomena of meaning, care, and attention that are related. And this is what Heidegger is trying to get at when he talks about a world as an equipmental contexture of things you can do with it. And Pete was trying to get at when he says it's things that are meaningful that wind up appearing to us.
Right. Okay.
Now, there may be other things that appear to us in some peripheral vision sense, but the things that are meaningful to us and our attention is critical to whether or not something actually appears in our world. Something appearing in our world and it having some meaning to us in some comportment or other we could be involved in with respect to it line up surprisingly well.
Well, for it to appear in my world, it has to have meaning, even if, let's say that some apparition that I cannot even conceive of right now is evident to me suddenly. I don't have any history of such apparition, but it has an instant meaning of unknowingness or something like that.
Right, but you're thinking about the wrong sort of problem. Joe and I could both have a meaningful interaction with the man in the gorilla suit on the stage that you never saw.
Mm-hmm.
When the only difference between us is that you were paying attention to something else. We both have the same or similar visual apparatus. We're both looking at the same video. We both have the same pixel rate, whatever, right? As mere AIs, we're supposedly experiencing the same experience, but we're not actually experiencing the same experience because part of our experience is what we bring to it. And that includes attention and care. So this is what Pete was trying to get at when he says the things we care about are the things that populate our worlds. Now, there may be enough commonality in the things that we care about and enough passive observational ways of caring about things that we often experience many of the same things. Absolutely. There's lots of commonality between your world and mine. But there doesn't have to be, right? Something can appear to me and not appear to you for reasons that have nothing to do with what the interworldly object itself was. So Heidegger is trying to lay out what a consciousness is in a way that leaves open the possibility of such phenomena, if that makes sense. Joe?
Just a comment, one of the principal starting points of all economic analysis comes from essentially this two worlds of view that you now articulated. Because value is something that I have and associate with various things and motives, and you have value and so forth, but there's no commonality in what those values are. And one of the utilities of having a so-called price system that sort of looks at transactions that you didn't do in order to see what you two guys might be able to accumulate and agree, the agreement thing, once again, measurement, The agreement thing comes in because you can say, oh, let's all agree that the price is, and we pick a number. And then we say, okay. And we finished, even though our values are still quite not commensurate. The reason we trade at all is because the values are different.
Yes. So, but the point there is that the agreement is the values being different, and it's, you don't even have to agree upon a price, right? The trade occurring, right, is simply an ordered preference, right? But the point of that is, yes, value in that economic sense is one of these phenomena of care, right? But it's not the only one. It's okay. So I'm trying to explain why, right after he introduced being in the world, he brought up this equipmental contexture business, right? And the first question is, what populates the world that we find ourselves in? And the answer is things we can interact with, first of all. The things around us, the things that we can interact with. And why does this matter? This is not simply he's trying to differentiate what world and beings in the world mean from something like a attempt to reduce consciousness to a movie camera. He's trying to explain why consciousness is not a movie camera, right? There is and he gets more elaborate later. He will say that there's something like a projection involved. There's something which is organizing a base stream of experience, if you want to put it that way. And Husserl talked a lot about how there's a base stream of experience of perceptions and impressions, and how those are organized into things and meanings are given to them and so on. He's much more mechanical about this sort of purely perceptual apparatus of all of that. And Heidegger tends to be faster and more flip about all that, because he sort of assumes you've already gotten it from Husserl to a degree. But the part that he is always emphasizing, Heidegger's always emphasizing, is that the perspectives that are being used to do that organizing are matters of care, but they're also matters of what you can do. Dasein is an acting creature, and not just in the Kantian sense of capable of following the moral law, but in the sense of causally plugged into the world, right? The Dasein knows that it has capabilities of action and decisions. Things matter to the Dasein because the Dasein can interact with them, and can interact with them differently. And some of those interactions with them are meaningful or even profitable, and others result in being eaten by tigers, right? The Dasein cares about its existence in the course of its actions, right? Its existence is at stake in what it chooses to do, right? So these are, again, brass tack phenomenal aspects of what it means to be an embodied intelligence that is not disinterested, right? You are piloting a set of cares. You are always piloting a set of cares. You don't choose to do that on Tuesdays, right? It's how you're built. It's what you are, that you are piloting a set of cares. That's the claim. So that's a little bit of what we mean by being in the world. Toward the end, he gives a quote from Rilke where he tries to explain how a poet sees things like this. And he gives the example of looking at the torn out side of a destroyed house. And I don't know that the example is clearer to people than the philosophy. For a lot of people, it's less clear, I would think. But the thing that he's trying to show you is that the imaginative mind, the poetic mind, the writerly mind, so to speak, the artistic mind, can look at environments that human beings have lived in and interacted with, and can see their interactions with them. They can see the psychological states of the people that lived there, as it were, embedded on the objects themselves. And when they're doing that, they're just imaginatively reversing the process that Heidegger is pointing out the other way. Heidegger is pointing out that the contents of consciousness come first from the environment, that it is, intraworldly beings that we are concerned with impress themselves upon us and form the content of our thoughts, right? I think about the room I'm in, I think about the screen I'm interacting with, whatever it is I'm doing, right? Things come at me and they determine contents of my consciousness, right? But those determining of contents of my consciousnesses are a kind of way in which the world, it's not even correct to say invades my mind. It forms my mind. When Descartes said, things which think are things whose determinations are thoughts, right? The things which are determining my thoughts are beings impressing themselves upon me all the time, right? So there may be other things, but that's the first one. That's the everyday one, the all the time one. And what is going on in the Rilke passage is Rilke is reversing that process. He's imagining that just as the objects invade the person's mind as they're living in them, that he can see the thoughts reinvade the objects. Rilke can. He can see all the thoughts that people had in that room on the dirty wallpaper of that room by a mere process of imagination, because he knows how, the person living with in the dirty wallpapered room was living. He can sympathetically go there, feel and see what that person felt and thought, and he can read it off the wall. But all he's doing there, all Rilke is doing there, is reversing the usual process of the items of concern around people informing the content of their thoughts. So in a way, there is a much more passive and almost theory-like view of human being here than we got in the moral heroism of Kant, but without any of the denigration that the animal had in Kant, right? He does say that it is only in its sort of everyday inauthentic existence that the Dasein gets all of its contents from the things around it. And he is going to have a version of, as opposed to the things where it acts for itself, that's a little bit like the moral heroism in Kant as authenticity or something like that. But he's very insistent that that inauthentic existence where you just get the content of your mind from the things around you is entirely genuine. When we say it's inauthentic, we only mean that it isn't entirely your own because it's coming from the world, but it's still entirely genuine. It's still part of what you are. It's part of what everybody is almost all the time. They are environing thing importers that get the contents of their thoughts from the, they just drink them in from around them. So, and he is insisting on that as characteristic of everyday Dasein. Okay, questions about any of that?
Are you going to go into a little bit more on the bottom of 160 where he talks about genuine and authentic and inauthentic and such as that?
Sure. So this is a little bit what I was just talking about, right? He says the Dasein's average understanding of itself takes the self as inauthentic. And what he means, but what the authentic there means is ownmost, eigenliegt, right? Self-like, really me, right? And the idea is it really my own? And the analysis in Being in Time and Here is that everyday Dasein normally isn't authentic in that respect. It's not really its own. It's just getting the content of itself from its environment, from the they of other people, and from the interworldly objects around it with which it is concerned, right? So the ordinary contents of your thoughts are tables and buildings and computers and mice that you're interacting with and whatever, right? The ordinary concepts of your thoughts are not you, right? And that is still genuine. That is what is actually happening to you. There is no lack of honesty about that being the fact. It's just the case that most of the time, the content of your thoughts are anything but you. And only occasionally, only rarely, only at peaks, so to speak, are you and what you really are the content of your thoughts and especially of your decisions, right? So if Kant was pointing to the possibility of moral action as this sort of heroic thing, Heidegger's version of that is the authentic decision, where you decide what you will be in the future by how you are acting now, right? That's what he's talking about as authentic, where you're choosing. The possibility of authenticity is the possibility of choosing your being for yourself, choosing yourself, and directing yourself as what you're going to be. That's what he means by authenticity. But it is possible to be authentic and genuine, and it is possible to be genuine and not authentic. Most of the time, when you're letting the world direct the content of your thoughts, you are being entirely genuine, but not authentic. Something else is driving. Carlos?
Is there a non-genuine description? I mean,
Sure. Non-genuine would be if you're, whatever you're experiencing, you're falsifying the evidence. A typical example is when you are bragging, when you are presenting a self that you would like others to see as a face or a mask, when it's not what you actually feel. And that kind of inauthenticity is characteristic of a lot of social existence, right? When you're living in your image in others, that's being non-genuine. It's, you know, just trying to seem for other people. That's what he means by non-genuine.
Got it.
Yep. Excellent question. So at the top of 161, the genuine, actual, or inauthentic understanding of the self takes place in such a way that this self, the self for thoughtless, random, common, everyday existence, reflects itself to itself from out of that to which it has given itself over. His point being that whatever you're concerned with becomes the contents of your thoughts, and you know it's in charge, right? The work you're doing determines what you think. You know, nothing else. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So we're groping towards a notion of being here, where being is going to wind up being something like a possible determiner of the contents of consciousness, right? This is the point of continuity with that Cartesian / Kantian notion we had of thoughts are possible determinations of consciousness. But for Heidegger, beings have, they're not opinions, that they have a reality to them, they have an externality to them, but they are still something like, the thought-like aspect of being is the following, that it has the character of something like a possible determination of the state of a Dasein, right? And that's what it also means to say that Dasein is a place or site where being happens, where being appears. Being appears or transpires to a Dasein is the same as saying that some being has determined this Dasein to this existence. I almost said thought, but it's actually existence.
Say that again, please.
Yeah, it's hard. There's subtle things. I was saying that Dasein is a place or site where being happens because the being that is happening to it is something like a determination of the content of that Dasein's existence at that time. We're groping towards a notion of being, right? We're trying to get to a notion of being which is going to be adequate to all the arenas of being. And there's a directive from back in Parmenides that being and thinking are the same, that we're going to wind up wrestling with. It's not simply true, but the aspect of which it is true, that being and thinking are similar, if not the same, is that being is something like a possible meaning content of to a consciousness. It's a possible determination of a consciousness. I'm putting that in two conscious terms and two idealistic terms. Heidegger is actually straddling the idealistic and the realistic here in a way that is characteristic of him. But I don't think it's misleading, especially in this chapter, to give the consciousness reading of it, because that's sort of what we're talking about here. Okay. The place that we're going to be heading towards in the next chapter, now that we've learned a little bit about what it means to have a world, is something like being appearing, or truth. That's going to be the subject of the next chapter when we think of the is in the sense of the cupola. And it's going to sound like it's going to sound for a while like it's diverging off into talking about logic, but it's going to end up asking, in what sense is Dasein always already living in the truth, living in a truth? Okay. There's another thing toward the end that I wanted to make sure I got to. I wish Jim was here with his questions, but I guess he had to leave. Right, intentionality. So there's a place here where he's talking about intentionality and transcendence, and he's trying to, here he has the problem of he's trying to differentiate his own view from Husserl. Much of this stuff about the meaning of a being or being in the world, not necessarily the full meaning of being in the world, but something like it as a consciousness, is something which you could have found in Husserl already. But on page 162, he's talking about this dwelling with things and transcendence. And the point of this is to differentiate between the notion of intentionality that you had in Husserl and what he sees as the thing actually going on. Intentionality was this idea that there's something about a directedness towards, about consciousness or thoughts that has some intended meaning that is the thing the thought is trying to be about. It's this pointer-like character of thoughts themselves, that they're trying to be about something, right? That was sort of the meaning of intentionality that you got in Husserl. And Heidegger agrees with that, but there's something more involved in that, which is, as he puts it, transcendence is a fundamental determination of the ontological structure of the Dasein. What does that mean? It's a complicated way of saying the Dasein's contents are always capable of coming from outside of itself. We already saw this in the idea that in being in the world, the contents of thought come to you from the world outside. Yes? Okay. That's another way of saying there's something about you that is always capable of getting its contents, thoughts, from the rest of the world, from things which are not you. And Heidegger is calling that transcendence as a characteristic of Dasein. Why transcendence? Because the objects that the Dasein is thinking about, right, are there for it, imported to it, because its own content can come to it from outside itself. Okay, this is a deeper understanding of intentionality that's trying to explain where intentionality comes from. Why are thoughts about things that are not just the mind? Why do we not spend all of our time thinking about our sense impressions, our streams of sense impressions? Why are we not all naturally Kantian transcendental idealists who think we only have perceptions of things and don't see things, right? Because Heidegger is very clear. We see things. We don't just see perceptions of things. Okay. That fact that we see things, not just perceptions of things, is this always already outside business. Is an aspect of having a world, which is the same as saying you're always already outside. And that's what he's calling here Dasein's transcendence. Transcendence in the sense of we are not just locked up in our consciousness, right? We're always plugged into the world. The world is plugged into us, right? We project the world because world plugging into us, right? Transpires, put it that way, without the putting the action on one side or the other. Okay, and that's what he's getting at on this page 162 with we understand intentionality more accurately by saying that it is Dasein that does the transcending, not the objects that we are understanding. It's not the couch over there that is transcendent. It's me that is transcendent in that I can have the content of my consciousness be that couch, right? So that's the point of this highlighted line. Transcendence is a fundamental determination of the ontological structure of the Dasein. So tables don't do this. This is the same reason that tables don't have worlds. Tables don't get their content by importing it from their surroundings. Which isn't to say that there aren't photons impinging on the side of the table, but that's not the same thing as getting its content from it. It's not a consciousness. It doesn't do that, right? But Dasein does. Dasein is transcendent in that sense. Okay. All right. The other thing we want to get is 170, mindness. This is his version of this is what is more important to them than being persons being ends, right? Persons were ends for Kant, and that was the reason that they had a certain dignity, right? But on 170, he's going much deeper than this. Or more basic than this. He's getting at the fact that Dasein is in each case mine, right? On 170, the Dasein exists in the manner of being in the world, and as such, it is for the sake of its own self. It is occupied with its own capacity to be, that it is for its own sakes belongs to the concept of existence being, just like the concept of being in the world. So it's not just that you have a world, it's that you are for the sake of the world that you have, right? This is a sense in which you are an end in yourself, way more basic than the Kantian one, and not dependent upon any prior moral heroism on your part. Your world is your world for you, right? That's in your nature, right? You have yourself and you have your world as yours. And no matter how much you might sometimes inauthentically worry about only your worth in terms of value to other people, right? In a more basic, natural sense, you are the author of your world, and your world is for you. Heidegger is a deep individualist for this reason, right? In a way that is way deeper than any being as an end that you get in Kant, which is like contingent upon your previous moral heroism or capacity for it or something. Just as a spirit, you have your world, and there is a height, a natural height and dignity in that for Heidegger that doesn't require any living up to some Stoic standard of moral heroism to be true. Okay.
So there's another point that came up with that kind of answered my own question I brought up earlier at the bottom of page 171, where he says, even what we encounter only fragmentarily, even what is only primitively understood in a Dasein, the child's world, is as intra-worldly laden, charged as it were, with world. That seems to answer the question that I had earlier, that
Yes.
it could be fragmentary. We do continue to develop it, but it's still world.
I can tell you where I'm able to perceive that fact that he just mentioned. It's play with kids. You know, the fascination in an infant's eyes and the peekaboo you play with them and their delight in it, right? You can see world in that, right? You don't have this experience with tables, right? So the fragmentary experience being freighted with world already, I think you can see very directly in that. There are some people who say they can also see it with their pets.
I was going to say, next come the dogs, cats, and octopuses.
Carlos.
The description you were given earlier about this encapsulation.
Yes.
Why do I think of solipsism when you say that? I know it isn't, but it reminds me of it.
Right. So let's take an actual solipsist. So there's Berkeley is an idealist of a solipsistic variety who thinks that the world as it appears to himself is the only world that exists and is real, and anything else that populates it is only a mere appearance. And in the case of Berkeley, that means that for him, he is alone with God. That is Berkeley's idealist attitude to the whole thing. And why is that not Heidegger? Heidegger is way more objective than that. Your world may have that character, but is populated by interworldly things.
And that's why I said it's not exactly that, but it just has a flavor of it.
Any description of how the world adheres to a consciousness is going to have that character because that experience is what is at the basis of solipsism. Solipsism's problem is that fascinated by that observation, it ignores everything else about human existence. Its thrownness, its finiteness, interworldly beings, always being already with others, etc., right? Which are also equally evident phenomenal experiences. So as with many mistakes, it has taken one fact and run with it and ignored all the facts that say the other thing. That's my own take on it. But let's also talk about how he sees what is intraworldly, right? He explains that intraworldly things don't have role in this sense because they don't need Dasein in order to be. Intraworldly things would be even if there were no Dasein. And nowhere is it written that it is necessary for a Dasein to exist. This is something no solipsist would ever write, right? It's why Heidegger can say when he's talking about being in the world, he's talking about being in the world. He's not talking about solipsism, right? The intraworldly beings, which don't have our manner of existence, but have their own manner of existence, the things which are extant, don't need us to be. So, and you know, that's his cure for solipsism, if you like. Yeah. Okay. Fine question. But on page 167, there were some people who would claim that this would, if you look at this world, it would all be too subjective. It's not quite the solipsism objective, but it's the too subjective objection. It's this, he's imagining the same kind of objection. And he says, even if the definition of the world as subjective led to idealism, that would not have decided and proved this interpretation is untenable. For to this very day, I'm unaware of any infallible decision according to which idealism is false, just as little as I am of one which makes realism true. To declare something to be idealism may, in contemporary philosophy, be a very dexterous partisan political stroke in outlawing it, but it is not the real ground of a proof. Viewed with minute exactitude, the anxiety that prevails today in the face of idealism is an anxiety in the face of philosophy. And this does not mean that we wish to equate philosophy straightway with idealism. Anxiety in the face of philosophy is at the same time a failure to recognize the problem that must be posed and decided first of all so as to judge whether idealism or realism is tenable. Point there is he's diagnosing in these attempts to dismiss whole categories of possible thought as, you know, dangerous and therefore unsound and therefore to not even be entertained. He calls that an anxiety in the face of philosophy. It's as though one is concerned that if philosophy were allowed to occur, it might upset one's world, right? He's very suspicious of such things. Anyway, I've gotten through most of the things I wanted to get through, other than a little bit of looking ahead to the next chapter. In the next chapter, the subject is going to be the being of the cupola, and there's going to be this capsule review of the history of logic. There'll be parts of it where he's talking about Hobbes and John Stuart Mill and other people who were like big in logic in the 1600s and 1800s. And in all those things, he'll seem to be on sound ground. And then he'll come to modern logic and he'll mention people you've never heard of who made contributions that at the time might have been thought of as important. But if people looked at the same period in which Heidegger is writing and tried to think of the people who were giants of logic, then it would never occur to them to mention these people. And I think that where he goes from all that is still okay in the sense that the problems he's going to bring out are fine, but let no one be under any illusions that Heidegger was up on things going on at the forefront of investigations into logic in the time when he was writing. He was not. He was not part of that stream at all. But it's easy to get distracted by that, especially if you know too much about the history of logic. Where he's actually trying to go with it, though, is something like this notion we got way back in chapter 1, where Kant was talking about something like ascribing being to something is like putting it into absolute position, right? and what it means to have a notion of truth content that is some meaning we're giving to being. We say that something is if it has positive truth content, something like that. And Heidegger is going to connect all that to a notion of a relationship between being and truth that he wants to ground in the characteristics of Dasein. The punchline is going to be that Dasein is always already in the truth. Typical Heideggerian formula. But that's a preview of where we're headed. So if you get rocky bits early on in the chapter, you sort of can know where it's going and know to persevere and push through to those parts. Nick, question?
Yeah, well, I just thought maybe it might be helpful if you gave us kind of a forest look rather than a tree look of this particular chapter. Because, I mean, it started out with kind of Descartes' res cogitans, res extensa, in the way Kant pretty much treated it.
Yes.
And it was, but then it jumped right into Heideggerian world.
Yes.
And res cogitans, res extensa,
So
exist. I couldn't see the connection now.
What's happened is that Heidegger thinks that he's given you the correct answer to the question of how res cogitan and res extensa actually differ. The answer is res cogitan exists like the Dasein and like the world, and res extensa are intraworldly beings. He thinks that the right distinction is not that between res cogitans and res extensa. He thinks the right distinction is between beings that have a world and intraworldly beings.
Okay.
And that's the distinction he wants to replace it, just as he wants to replace the I cogito with Dasein. He thinks Dasein is the more adequate concept. It's more adequate than consciousness. It's more adequate than the I think. It's more adequate than the ego as a description of what is actually happening. And similarly, he thinks that extant beings, intraworldly beings, beings that appear in Dasein's world but do not need Dasein in order to be, the extant is a better characterization of the beings that have the form res extensa.
So the notion of consciousness then, which is important because of the separation of substance, and how do you get the consciousness, and how does res that all goes away as well. There's no problem with that with Heidegger.
That problem was a problem about substance, which was ousia, which was the notion that there is one extant kind of being, and only that kind of being exists. And then you have to decide how can that one kind of substance have two modes, like you got in Spinoza, or perhaps in Descartes, right? Debatable in Descartes, but certainly there in Spinoza. And for Heidegger, this is completely replaced by the distinction between the extant and the existent, between things which are in the manner of Dasein, which exist, and things which are intraworldly or extant. And he has not made any claim anywhere in that there is about causality in any direction, right? He's going, the causality stuff that we know is actually coming from Dasein and from the functional world in which the Dasein is embedded, which is constructed of its own purposes. And you could easily make the case that all causality thinking stems from that. In that sense, you don't have to prove the Dasein's capability of acting with some notion of causality that lets minds and bodies somehow interact. Why do you not have to prove that? Because Dasein's ability to act and its concern and care over its ability to act is the Dasein. A Dasein that cannot act in the world would not have the structure that it has. So there is a phenomenal proof of the possibility of Dasein acting from the facts of its structure. Nothing would have this structure if it could not act in the world. And it does have this structure. Therefore, Dasein can act in the world and does. That is the solution to all of the mind-body problems in Descartes. Carlos?
Quick question.
Excellent question, by the way. Carlos?
Would it be inaccurate to say that the cogito is encapsulated inside the sign?
It's not encapsulated, because the whole point about Dasein is that it's not a capsule. It's not an inside. It's plugged into the world. The cogito idea was that there was a consciousness that was somehow an encapsulated inside that only had little windows out to an outside, and only saw little things on the screen between. And by the time of Hegel, only was the whole thing, because the pictures on the movie screen were just projected by it, and the capsule was the world by the time of the idealists like Hegel, right? But it was all capsule, it was all inside, right? And Heidegger, with the notion of that the Dasein is fundamentally transcendent, is trying to completely destroy that notion. Consciousness is not an inside. The difference between consciousness and Dasein is precisely that Dasein is an outside. It is a there being, it is a place or a site where being happens, and as such, it is always already plugged into the world. If it's not plugged into the world, it wouldn't have the structure that it has. You don't have to worry about how it plugged into the world. It's made plugged into the world.
Slowly, it's beginning to make sense, but I've been battling with that concept for the last year and a half.
This is why this is actual philosophy. It's because so many of the schemas of thought and modern thought, right, are not this way. They're all about other ways of thinking about these things, and other ways of thinking want to put everything into the categories that they know. And so they'll take a thought like this and try to put it into its own categories, and it won't fit because it's disagreeing with those categories.
One more question about philosophy in general. I read several times, and I've heard you guys talk about the word moment. What does that moment mean in philosophy? And I take it as not an instant in time necessarily, but it has other connotations.
Right. So moment is used in multiple senses. It's ambiguous. Sometimes people mean by moment only an instant in time, but often they mean by moment the same thing you mean by moment in mechanics, where you just mean an aspect of a balance between things. A moment. We talk about the subject pole and the object pole of distinction, and we talk about those two things as two different moments. We're talking about them like moment arms in some mobile or something. So moment is often used in just that allusion to structure sense. That's probably what you heard.
Yeah. All right. Thank you.
Yeah. Good question.
So in a sense, going back to the dogs and cats, Heidegger doesn't address that question, but he doesn't shut it out either. I mean, dogs and cats act. They have worlds that we assume, but he doesn't necessarily limit this to only a human activity. There could be plenty of other
As a matter of the correct phenomenology, I agree with you. As a matter of the history of was Heidegger always careful about that sort of thing and not claim more for human distinctiveness than he should? I'm less clear, right? I think there are places where he does. Sometimes it's not clear if he's just explicating somebody else claiming that and he's not claiming it himself. He certainly has Kant claiming that this aspect of humanity is never shared by any animal, right? I think it's an open question whether or not Heidegger himself ever makes claims like that. There are places in Max Schiller where you find an otherwise informed phenomenologist who does make claims like that. I think often wrongly. I think the phenomenal evidence for it is weak, right? I think that the infant and the dog have a lot in common, so to speak. But one of the things that this really comes down to is language, and how important language is for any of this. I don't think language is nearly as important for structures like being in the world and awareness as some do. And it's the only thing which you can say distinguishes both the pre-linguistic toddler and the but still proto-possible language-oriented and the higher animals. But I personally think that awareness in this sense is very clearly possible for the higher animals, but I only say possible because I don't know more than that. But I don't see any particular phenomenological reason to deny it there. But that doesn't mean you won't ever find a passage in Heidegger where he does. I don't know that he's that guarded about it. But fair question. All right, so for next time, we're just reading that chapter 4. So it's takes us down to page 226 or 225.
What, 50 pages, I guess?
Yep, roughly. Each of our next two readings should be about 50 pages. This one and then the one after that is going to be just part 2, section 19 only, and there'll be a third session for the last piece. So we're going to do 3 more sessions,
50
chapter 4,
each.
then two for the next part. My next question is when people want to meet next. I have some constraints. I'm actually the weekend of President's Day, which is the 18th through the 21st. I'm actually up in Sedona for vacation. So I'm going to suggest Sunday, the 27th of February, if that works for people. That'll be 4 weeks from today. Get a thumbs up from Pete.
I'll make it work. That's the
Okay.
fourth weekend, but I'll make it work.
Okay. Yeah, I know that
Do you
sometimes
have any-
hard to. Go ahead.
Jason, do you have any idea which book you're going to read next? Or do you decide?
I always ask people what they want to do next. So I'm always open to suggestions on that. We haven't settled it. There's lots of possible places we could go, but including some things we
But
talked
are
about
you
before.
guys a Heidegger group or a medieval group? Or do you, no?
Anything, just philosophy group. And we actually got started on this stuff in part because Jim asked me to teach something on some of the philosophy I was interested in. And so I said, well, I'd love to teach you guys being in time, right? But you know, but that's really challenging. We could take most of a year. And they said, let's just do it, and so we did it. But sorry.
No, I interrupted you. Go ahead. I'll wait.
So I mean, we've done the last book we did was this one, The Unknown God by Diedrich Carabine, and this was about Neoplatonism in the ancient world. We got off on that because previous to that we had done Hans Jonas on Gnosticism. Hans Jonas was one of Heidegger's talented students, a friend of Hannah Arendt. And then before Jonas on Gnosticism, we did a book by Etienne Gilson called Being and Some Philosophers, which was which is in part because we wanted to get a history not just from Heidegger's perspective on the question of being. In between there, we also did some stuff on Kierkegaard. I think we did one session on Chesterton. And before the Etienne Gilson, we had done more Heidegger. We had done his volumes 3 and 4 of his book on Nietzsche.
If I may,
Sure.
Because it's somewhat germane in my mind to what we're talking about here. How about Transcendence of the Ego from
Yes.
what is it, Sartre?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I have mostly preferred to do Heidegger and Nietzsche on existentialism. We did do some Levinas. We did Levinas on Husserl, actually.
Okay,
But,
whatever. But whatever you put out there, I'm sure I'll benefit from it.
I'm glad to hear it,
Would this
but
be
I am also always interested in people's input on what they would like to do. So
Would this be too heavy? Is it
Mhm.
kind of related to what we're reading and it's related to
yeah,
Heidegger?
that's not too heavy. It's
Not too
in
heavy?
continuity with what we have. The one thing I will say is that it's not necessarily the most accessible to those who don't have as much Kant. The other Heidegger that makes sense to do sort of on the same level as this book is The Introduction to Metaphysics. It's a relatively easy book for people who are trying to get to understand Heidegger. There are other things we could do there. We had previously talked about possibly doing either his Parmenides or his Sophist, but this is the one you're talking about. We could do this. I mean,
no,
that's
I think I'm just
if we want to do more Heidegger. I sometimes have done it as let's do a giant bit of Heidegger, let's do something else, let's come back to Heidegger.
Right.
But if people want to keep going on Heidegger and there's a particular direction they want to go, I'm open to it.
The problem might be that it has too much Kant in it, and people haven't read Kant, so maybe
Right.
not a good idea.
I mean, at some point we're going to, bite the bullet and read Kant, but I don't want to follow this one up with a critique of pure reason. I think that would be a little bit too heavy. Yeah, but
Okay.
I'm open to suggestions. Do think about what else you want to do. We typically at the last session, try to have some summing up of the sort of general meaning of the whole book, and reactions to it. And then we also usually talk about what people want to do next at that session. So that'll be in a few months at this point. All right.
So it's February 27th, the next one?
Yes, February 27th, chapter 4, for our next session. I'll also say that the recording of this one I'll put up on YouTube later tonight if people want it for review. And the previous sessions are also up there. You also can feel free to send me questions either in the private message site off Meetup or by email. If you need my email, just private message me for it. I always, I'm willing to take questions between sessions. Sometimes people, come up with questions afterwards. You also can just bring questions to the next session if you want. That's also entirely okay. All right, well, this was great. Thanks, everybody. And going to stop recording now and see you guys.